When I was 9 years old, my mom finally bought her first house in 2004. The house had 5 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a basement with a washer and dryer. However, my favorite part of the house was the backyard. To help you understand our home's layout, a flight of stairs led to the first floor, which had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Then you walked 3 steps into the kitchen and living room areas. On the second floor, a flight of stairs led to the first room. After a slight left turn, 3 small stairs lead to my room and my mother's. Next to the bathroom, we also use a small closet to store bed sheets and towels. The second flight of stairs is in the living room, where I saw her on a rainy night. I needed to get some water from the kitchen, but I didn't want to wake my sister, who was sleeping in the living room, so I didn't turn on the light. Standing in the kitchen, I noticed something unusual from the staircase. Initially, I thought it was my mother coming down to check who was in the kitchen. However, I soon realized that she wasn't moving at all. Then, I noticed a person staring at me, but it didn't seem like a typical stare. It was as if they were staring into me or through me in an eerie and unsettling way. She had peeling gray skin with holes where her eyes should have been, and a gaping black hole where her mouth would have been. It was lined with a plethora of razor-sharp teeth. I froze and ran to my sister's room. I pulled the covers over my head and closed my eyes real tight until they hurt. That's when I heard the screams. They were like 1,000 animals all dying at once in the most gruesome way you can think of. It was loud and heinous and sounded like something out of hell. It was terrifying. I thought I was gonna pee myself. I didn't know what to expect, so I covered my ears, hoping it would soon stop. The walls shook, and it felt like the house was being lifted from its very foundation. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. The screaming would be heard throughout the house, making my body fearless. I thought eventually it would stop or at least calm down, but unfortunately it never did. This went on for months until the house actually burned down from an electrical fire. I saw her walking out of the front door as the house was being put out. She wasn't screaming this time. Instead, she had a simple smile. I matched with a guy on Hinge, and we didn't really get to know each other much before we agreed to meet up. I was okay with this, as usually I prefer it that way, and I had never had a bad experience doing that before. We decided to see the new Saw movie and meet at the theater. When I first saw him, I thought he was so cute and he was definitely my type. I even texted my friend while he was buying our drinks to tell her how cute he was. I was really looking forward to seeing where this night might take us. My partner and I were sitting in our seats, enjoying the movie. However, he started asking me questions about my body that made me feel a bit uncomfortable, particularly about the size of my breast and whether he could touch them. Despite my attempts to put some distance between us, he kept repositioning me closer to him. He was aroused during the goriest scenes, which made me a bit uncomfortable. The movie finally finished, and we were walking to the parking lot. It was a little walk, so it took a couple of minutes to get to where we were parked. On the way there, he was trying to convince me to get into his car and asked if I had ever been in a Tesla. Now, a little thing about me is that I usually don't have an issue getting in somebody's car, whether it's to drive to a different destination or just sit in the car to talk for a bit. I generally have good experiences with guys, as they are usually sweet and pretty respectful. That's why I've never had a bad feeling about getting into their cars. However, when it came to this man, something inside me was telling me not to get into his car. It was almost 10 p.m. and the parking lot was somewhat empty. I told him that I was tired and needed to head home. He began walking me to my car, and that's when I realized I had parked in a secluded spot, and this made me rather nervous. We get to my car and he keeps asking me for kisses while grabbing me, and at this point I'm genuinely scared, so I told him just to peck, but I needed to get the heck out of here. I was standing alongside the driver's door, so he pressed himself against me, with his arms holding on to me. I tried pushing him off, but he wouldn't move. And then, he finally did it. I told him again, I really need to go, but he started saying please, just go with him to his car, and how he needs this. I was honestly terrified, and was still trying to be nice, so I gently shoved him down, shut him down, and got into my car and drove away. Still, as I was starting to get in, he tried to force himself on me again, and I don't know how I was able to get him off, and I just somehow did it. When he began walking to his car, I immediately drove off in fear that he would follow me or something. I just cried the whole way home. This is the first time I've told this story in its entirety, with as many details as I can. It's a bit scary, but it's nice to finally get it off my chest. This incident happened to me in my early teen years, sometime around 13 or 14 years old. It has been quite a while since then, as I'm 21 now, so some of these details may not be very fresh in my mind. For context, I grew up in a regular house with 2 floors, upstairs and a basement, with my older brother Luke, who is 3 years older than me. He was around 16 or 17 at the time of the event. I'm not sure if it was just our imaginations or if there were unexplainable events going down. Luke and I frequently spotted strange things in our house, including ghostly figures and shadowy apparitions. Luke and I often witnessed strange things happening. We would see an old woman singing in the rocking chair in the living room, but when we would try to confront them, they would always disappear into thin air. Additionally, we both saw shadow figures out of the corner of our eyes. The basement was the worst, and we avoided going down there alone at all cost. The atmosphere gave us chills as if we were not alone. It's worth noting that neither of us had any mental health problems, and we still don't. We used to share our experiences with our parents, but they would often dismiss them as just our imagination. I mean, I couldn't blame them, as for a long time I thought that Luke's and my fears were feeding off of each other. However, on this particular night, I know what I saw plain and clear. This was not my or my brother's imagination. Previously, the things we would see would be very quick appearances, disappearing rather quickly, to the point that I had to question if I had really just seen that. However, this night was different entirely. My family and I had just sat down to watch a movie together. We did this often on the weekends. Anyway, before we started the movie, I got up to go to my room to grab something. I don't quite remember what I was getting. My room was just down the hall from the living room where we would be watching the movie, and when I opened the bedroom door and walked in a few feet of my room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing in the middle of the room, looking directly at me was, well, me. It wasn't like a solid person. It was more like a ghostly apparition. You could tell it wasn't a real person. She was just standing there, looking at me with this wide grin, unblinking, unmoving, unwavering. I remember being frozen in fear. I couldn't even scream or make a peep. I was looking at an apparition of myself. She wore the same clothes I had on in the moment, and everything about her looked just like me. I'm not sure how much time passed. It must have only been a few seconds, but it felt like several minutes, when out of nowhere, this apparition ran towards me, breaking the several feet of distance we had between us. At this point, I had regained control of myself and began turning away, about to run, but she reached out very quickly and ran right through me instead of stopping. I spun around, and she was gone. At this point, I just sped out of my room and shut the door, not even grabbing whatever I had gone in there for. I didn't even say anything to my parents or brother. I just sat on the couch as they played the movie. You can bet I didn't pay much attention to that movie though. I just was petrified the entire time. Of course, I never told anybody about what happened until now, and I still slept in my room that night, even though I was absolutely terrified from the experience hours prior. For quite some time after that night, I was always afraid of my room, and I always kept my door open when I was there for quite a long time after. I was terrified I would see that apparition of myself again. Eventually, however, I did try my best to forget about it, and teenage life definitely helped that. It never did happen again, so I figured I could tuck it into an encounter of the back of my mind. Since that experience, I've been fascinated with the paranormal, albeit still a little scared of all things paranormal, but fascinated nonetheless. It wasn't until recently that I was listening to one of the earlier videos on this channel. Some of the stories were about doppelgangers, and they had me thinking about my own experience. I had never considered what I saw as maybe a doppelganger, but I've been doing some research recently and wonder if I did maybe see it. If anybody has any ideas, definitely let me know in the comments. To give you some background on this story, I grew up in a small town in the middle of Washington state. The town has a population of around 850 people, which means that besides a yearly parade, there isn't really anything going on, and it's kind of a dead-end town. During the time that this story takes place, people were mostly concerned about the economic crash and drugs slowly making their way into the town. But that's a whole different story for a whole different episode. In our town, where there were 2 gas stations that were both owned by Chinese immigrants, the events of this story took place back in 2009 when my friends and I were hanging out in the town during the summer. We all had our scooters and rode up the few streets racing each other and having conversations that were typical of kids our age. We talked about things like Pokemon, girls, and the latest movies and music that were popular at the time. As we were riding behind one of the old stores, we all heard a commotion going on in the street in front of us. We decided to go ahead and ride to where we heard everything, and there, I saw something I never would have expected. I saw multiple cop cars, an ambulance, and a giant pool of blood on the sidewalk across the street. A crowd of townspeople was building by this point, as nothing of this magnitude had ever really happened here. All of us in the crowd were clamoring, trying to find out what had happened, and it would take a couple of weeks to really learn the full story. There was a gas station with old-fashioned pumps. You had to turn the handle to fill up your vehicle. After filling your tank, you would pay for what you owed inside the station. Many people liked the station because it was cheaper than other ones. However, one day when a customer arrived, things took a turn for the worse. From what I heard about this after later on reading about it, the guy did all the steps except wanting to go in and pay. Almost on instinct, the station's co-owner walked out, a woman in her 40s, telling him he needed to pay for the gas. And then, without warning, he ran over to her and hit her with his vehicle, proceeded to back over her and drive over her again. From what I heard, the initial scene was awful, and she was confirmed dead at the scene. The police apprehended the man, and the local broadcast of the case gripped the town. It turned out that the man was mentally unstable, most likely suffering from some sort of paranoid schizophrenia. During the trial, he claimed that he was Jesus Christ and demanded that everyone in the court bow before him. After the trial, it was unsurprising that he was deemed insane and unfit for a murder trial. This was unexpected, given his previous criminal record, but the judge took into account that the defendant was off his medication. Following this incident, people moved on, and it's now scarcely remembered except by those who actually witnessed it. I've seen a few stories on this show in the past about how carrying a can of gas in your trunk is dangerous. First of all, that's just nonsense. First, unless someone rear-ends you while you're on fire, there's much more of a risk of explosion or fire from the gas in your tank. Secondly, the dangers you're putting yourself in by not carrying spare gas far outweigh the apparent risk of doing so. And now I'll tell you why. I used to drive around the country a ton as a part of traveling and being a salesman. Before my retirement, I was an aluminum siding salesman, and although it was a tough job that kept me away from my family for weeks at a time, it was incredibly financially rewarding.
especially in northern states like Nebraska where winter temperatures could drop to dangerous levels. So as you might have guessed, I ended up stuck by the side of the highway one rough winter when I discovered I had forgotten to top my gas can before my journey. I was furious with myself, but almost pretty frightened. The weather was making a turn for the worst, and it would be hazardous to go looking for a gas station. So I was forced to hitchhike. The thing about the Midwest is that people can be much, much friendlier than out on the East Coast. Maybe it's those rural sensibilities, but I was on that highway for a lot less time than I expected when a car pulled up on the verge, and a driver enthusiastically invited me to hop in. He told me his name was Donald, and the vehicle he was driving was like anything I'd ever seen. He turned the thing into a mobile home, and the car looked highly lived in. Laptop and phone chargers were running out of battery attachments, garbage was dumped in the footwells, and even a loudspeaker was grafted on top of the car. It almost looked like a police cruiser from some post-apocalyptic future. Anyway, I climbed into this guy's car and explained that I needed him to drive me to the nearest gas station if possible so I could get back on the road. In a raspy, gravelly voice, he agrees to help me out, and we are on our way. But as soon as we are back on the highway, he starts asking me probing questions about my life and job. When I tell him I'm an aluminum siding salesman, he starts accusing me of trying to trick sweet old ladies out of their pensions for paneling that would have them freezing to death in the winter. Now obviously I took serious offense to this. I wasn't some vulture who preyed on the weak. I took pride in my work, even if it wasn't what I dreamt of doing when I was a kid. Donald backed off a little bit at this point and grumbled an apology through gritted teeth. He told me he'd met many bad people in his life, how he didn't mean anything by it, and how he was glad I was one of the good guys. We dodged this conversational bullet when a gas station finally came into view. Donald pulled off the road where I hopped out and headed over to grab a spare gas can. At first, I figured he might drive off on me, and I silently prepared myself that to be the case. Only, he didn't. He stayed, just as he said he would. Yet, as I'm walking back over to Donald's vehicle, something catches my eye that has my heart racing. I can see a flame inside the car. Small enough to be from a cigarette lighter, but still alarming. Given that he's using a lighter in a goddamn gas station, do you really want to talk about serious dangers? There's one right there. I crack the car door and I'm about to ask him what he's thinking when I see exactly what he's doing with the lighter. Donald was burning his hair. "What the hell are you doing, man?" I remember asking him in total and utter confusion.
"Saves money on the haircuts,"
he replied. But here's the thing. I could hear the pain in his voice as the flames reached the scalp and fizzled out.
"Besides, you gotta get it nice and hot when you're feathering it, brother."
I was utterly lost for words. He was using a cigarette lighter to style his hair. So I asked him again what he thought he was doing, using a lighter at a goddamn gas station. He snapped back at me, but I asserted that I was holding a freaking gas canister in my hand and he should put that thing away before I got back in. But that's not even the weirdest thing he did. Driving me back to my car, Donald began complaining about tooth pain. I sympathized a great deal. My daughter had some dental work done that previous year and it had cost us a fortune. That and tooth pain can be terrible. So I began to relate the story of my daughter's ordeal. That's when he began to growl and pull over to the side of the road. He seemed furious, and at first I was worried he would try to kick me out of the car, right then and there on the side of this icy highway. But I could never have anticipated what he did next. Donald reached under the driver's seat and pulled out one of the biggest freaking hunting knives I had ever seen in my life. He looked at me, holding the thing tight in his grip, and gave me a wolfish grin. I'm not embarrassed to admit that I was terrified. The guy wasn't playing with a full deck if you're catching my meaning, and I slowly prepared to throw myself out of the passenger side if he went for me with the blade. But he didn't. Instead, Donald put the knife into his mouth and I heard the sharp edge grind against one of his teeth as he bit down on it. I remember desperately wanting to ask him what he was doing, but the words just wouldn't come out. So all I could do was watch as a few drops of blood suddenly bubbled between his lips and ran down his chin. He was ripping his goddamn tooth out with the knife blade. It was horrific, and in the end I couldn't bring myself to watch as he grunted and growled, his raspy voice grinding in agony as he dislodged a tooth with a sickening crunch. As I said, I wasn't watching, but I listened as he spat the broken tooth into his palm, rolled down the window, and tossed it onto the highway.
"You could have saved a few dollars on your daughter like that, brother,"
he said, in between spitting out mouthfuls of blood through the open driver's door window. Again, I couldn't find the words. I was utterly just left in shock and disbelief at what I had been witnessing. Luckily, we rolled up to my gasless car not long after, and as promised, David slowed to a stop and let me out, which helped me get back on the road. I thanked him genuinely, and all he did was let out his horrifying gravelly laugh. It sounded genuinely evil, but I don't think he was meaning any harm. He was just manic. I still think about Donald sometimes and wonder how he's doing, if he still lives in that car performing self-surgery. But on that off chance he comes across this story somehow, thanks Donald, but please get some help.
At the time, I was a 20-year-old female who had just moved to a small upstate town. I had grown up in a slightly larger town about 60 miles away and just wanted a new start. I love camping and often go camping in the Adirondacks, but at the time, I hadn't yet made friends to go camping with, so I wasn't going to go into the real woods alone, if you know what I mean. Down the road from me, I had been walking around and found an area where the power lines cut through a wooded section. The power lines were perpendicular to the road. It was near a house, but far enough to the right to the place where I don't think anybody would see me if they were walking the trail that the power lines made. I'm not sure about other countries, but in the United States, they keep power lines clear in case of maintenance. So I wander up there, noticing how it's pretty deep woods, and how far I can get away from the house that I saw on the road. They couldn't possibly think I'm trying to break in. And then, bing, I get an idea. I could go camping up here. It's secluded enough to give the natural woods experience, but close enough to the road that I wouldn't be in danger of wildlife or anything like that. So, I do. I set up camp in this little clearing that I accessed by climbing the hill, following the power lines, then turned left onto what seemed to be some sort of deer trail. Deer are absolutely everywhere in New York. Then I came upon this lovely flat, grassy clearing. After clearing the dead wood away, I built my fire off to the side. I'm feeling brilliant and independent. It was creepy to sleep in the woods alone, sure, as I had always had at least one camping companion. But hey, whatever. New experiences build new skills, you know? I wandered further down the path the next day to see where it led. I walked for about an hour, and I can see some fields on the right, but they are in the distance, and there is a fence between the fields and the path. So again, I figure people can't be mad for me being here. Then I come across another path. Heading to the right, I follow it. A couple of feet in, it curves slightly, and there's an old van to the left of the path. Well, that's strange. But it's about 1 p.m. near noon anyway, in broad daylight, and the birds are chirping, so I don't really feel in danger. I go up to the van, which had been there for a very long time, clearly. It was like a 70s style make. It made me kind of think of Scooby-Doo, and there were overgrown weeds all around it. There are streaks of brownish red going down the side from the bottom of the doors. I looked in and saw what appeared to be an old bedding or something in the back, but it was all shredded up, and the curtains in the windows were shredded as well. There was clothing strewn about. It looked like the clothing was from the 70s or early 80s. I still felt no danger per se. Snickering at the terrible fashions back in the day, I continued along the path for a short time, until I finished rounding another slight bend. I stopped dead in my tracks. Finally, my reptile sense went off, or whatever you call it. I wake the hell up, and my head is screaming at a total volume that I've never heard before. Up ahead, there is this creepy-ass doll hanging from a tree by its neck with a noose. Not just stuck in the trees, but just left there as it was hanging. It was terrifying, to say the least. To the right of it, though, there was this huge cage-like structure, easily big enough to hold a full-sized human. It seems to be made up of pipes and other long metal objects, just welded together. Some were up, some were down, some were across, and the squares they made weren't big enough to fit my head through, let alone anything else. Not that I tried, anyway. It had 4 sides and a ceiling. It had other creepy-ass dolls hanging from it. It also had reddish-brown stains running down the sides, just like the van. Further behind it in the distance was a rundown house. A few years ago, I decided I needed a significant life change. Everything seemed to be going downhill. My finances, my mental health, my life. I would go weeks without sleeping sometimes as the heavy traffic passed through the city streets below. Every time I went outside, I saw homeless people, more needles and crack pipes littering the ground, more muggings and assaults and overdoses and deaths. The city had become a wasteland, and I knew it was my time to leave. I had no girlfriend, no wife, no kids. My parents had both died a few years prior, and I barely talked to my siblings anymore. I had nothing to tie me down to this place where I felt like I was dying inside a little more each and every day. That was when I sold nearly everything I owned, got in my car, and drove up to Alaska to try to start anew. I bought a small cabin and a plot of land in the middle of its majestic mountains and dark enchanting forest. In the winter, the northern lights would shine through like the eyes of God, sending out divine trails of light that danced through the sky in cosmic waves. While the move did help give me some peace of mind, the source of all my problems had ultimately followed me 1,000 miles into the endless wilderness. It would take me a long time to realize that because of all the misery was inside of myself, that I would never escape it. Because as a wise man once said, wherever I go, there I am. I lived in that cabin for 3 months without any major issues, aside from the constant threat of bears, moose, and wolves. I had a rifle and a shotgun for hunting, a small garden in the backyard, and a solar panel to generate electricity. "This is the life," I said, relaxing on a hammock, strung across the corner of the cabin, while staring at the endless beauty directly outside my window. White-capped mountains loomed like giants in the thick clusters of evergreens. A virgin covering of fluffy snow made their entire world glisten and sparkle. There wasn't a house or road in sight. No work, no stress, no pollution, no cars honking all the time. I closed my eyes, breathing in the air. I fell asleep for a couple of hours, waking up just as the sun had started setting. Bright orange streaks mixed with bloody smears of the fading light as they disappeared behind the mountains. I groggily arose, stumbling over to make a cup of instant coffee. As I sipped it, I wandered around the room, looking for something to pass the time. There were still quite a few random objects left behind by the last owner that I hadn't really gotten rid of yet. I had moved in just to find a stocked bookshelf full with classics like Philip K. Dick, Isaac Asimov, and Robert Heinlein. Bored, I started rifling through the collection, looking for something good to pass the time. As I shuffled past A Maze of Death and Ubik, something caught my eyes. A black, leather-bound book with no title or author name stood there, its cover faded with time and wear. Curious, I pulled it out and opened it. I saw the cursive scrawled across the pages in a neat, copper-plate script and realized it was a diary left by the previous owner. The first entry date was January 9th, 2015, and this is what it said. "I don't know if I'm going crazy or not. I went into town to talk to my therapist yesterday, and she said I should try writing everything down. She talks to me like it's all in my head, but I know it's not. When I first moved into the cabin, it seemed like paradise. I never thought in a million years that something would be slinking around at night, hiding under my bed, peeking in windows, and following me like a shadow. Right now I'm snowed in with a cup of coffee in one hand and a pistol in the other. I can't sleep anymore, and I keep hearing something shuffling around under the bed. Sometimes I think I even hear ragged breathing, as if a corpse with dirt in its lungs had come back to life. I caught a glimpse of that thing in the darkness. Whatever it is, its skin is loose, almost falling off the bone. It looks like a naked, emaciated man. Its eyes are rotted and dark, its back hunched, its spine twisted and jutting out like tumors. It moves slowly, jerky, but I can never catch it. Its body seems broken and out of alignment. Its legs bend the wrong way sometimes. When I turn the lights or try to take a video of it, it's always disappeared. But its fetid odor remains. It lingers in the cabin like a sweet-smelling, spreading infection. I don't know what it wants from me. I want to leave, but the storm raging outside is keeping me stuck here, unable to get back to town. The snow surrounds the cabin in mounds 5 feet high. I feel like a prisoner caged in with a rabid beast, not knowing when it will strike. My wife claims she hasn't seen or heard anything, but keeps vanishing on me. Last night she disappeared in the middle of a snowstorm. Where did she go? I asked her in the morning, but she said that she was there the whole time. She didn't remember anything. There's no way she went into town. There wasn't time, and the trails were impassable that far down. Something's happening out here, but I don't know what it was. I'm petrified for our lives. I slammed the diary shut, not wanting to read any more.
I didn't want to become infected by a contagious cabin fever. If the last owner had gone insane in the mountains and started hallucinating naked corpses crawling around, I didn't want to know. I shoved the diary back in the bookshelf, going for a maze of death instead. I tried to forget what I had read in the diary as I flew through the novella. All right, I tried to get the image of the naked, twisting man with the rotted eyes out of my head, but I couldn't. I eventually fell asleep right before dawn, but as my eyes were closing, I thought I saw a silhouette in the window, a starved man with excited black eyes that seemed to be rotting out of his skull. I thought I saw him with his inhumanly long fingers pressing them against the glass as he leaned forward. I blinked, sitting up and glancing out into the white, snow-covered wonderland. There was nothing there. Another hunter occasionally followed the deer trails near my cabin. A frozen lake stood a quarter-mile away, the surface white and covered in thick snowdrifts. Bundled up, I decided to go outside for a hike in the frigid dawn. I strapped on my snowshoes and grabbed my shotgun, as I always did when I went outside. After all, I knew then that polar bears might be waiting around and could be around any tree. I opened the door, seeing footprints pressed into the snow around my house. At first I thought it was the silhouette that I had seen, the nightmarish thing from the diary, but the footprints didn't go over to my window. They followed the trail 20 feet away, veering off towards the frozen lake at the bottom of the hill. I glanced down in that direction, seeing a black figure slowly forward. "Steve!" I cried, recognizing my only neighbor within a 4-mile radius. He had a cabin about a mile away on his little plot. He jumped, clearly startled by my sudden noise. His black snow pants and heavy fur coat swished together as he spun, raising his rifle high. When he saw me, he immediately lowered the rifle and put a gloved hand up in a friendly greeting. "Hey Josh, surprised to see you up this early," he yelled over the muted wintry landscape. Sounds always seemed different after snowing, as if the world's noise had faded and died. "Yeah, I've been having some trouble sleeping," I said, slinging my gun around my shoulder. "What are you doing anyway?" "Just a little hunting, you know," he said, giving me a wink. "Animals are always more active at dusk and dawn." That's when I always have the best luck anyway. He stepped close to me, staring at me in the eyes. "You do look pretty terrible. Those bags under your eyes are big enough to carry groceries in." "Yeah, trust me, I know." "Hey, this might sound a little weird, but did you know the previous owner of this cabin?" I asked. Steve's wrinkled old face fell into a scowl. His expression immediately became guarded and distant. Sure, we met," he exclaimed bluntly. He searched my face for something, but I didn't know what. His reaction left me feeling off balance and nervous. "Are they still around?" I said. Steve's scowl deepened. "Buddy, I don't know what this is all about, but he's dead. He's been dead. He died in that cabin." He pointed a finger at my home accusingly. With those words, my heart seemed to drop into my stomach. Waves of dread flowed through my body like water. "How did he die? Like a heart attack or something?" I asked. Steve's gaze turned downwards, and he met my eyes. "Do you know that Alaska has the highest missing persons rate in the entire United States? It's not even close. In fact, for the population size, we have far more people who go missing and never found than anywhere else. They even have a name for it, the Alaskan Triangle," Steve said. "And we're square in the middle of it, buddy." I stared blankly at him, wondering where he was going with this. It seemed like a way to avoid answering my question. "No, I didn't know that," I responded. Steve nodded, raising his head again. He heaved a deep sigh. "Look, the thing with the last owner and his wife is somewhat disturbing. I'll tell you if you want to know, but I will not help your peace of mind because this will make everything worse. It's not going to help you get some sleep, you know what I mean?" I want to know," I insisted instantly. The wind started to whip past us. Flakes of ice and snow flew sideways in the sudden currents. "Let's go back to your cabin then," Steve said, pulling his heavy fur-lined hood off and shaking his long, black hair behind him. I could use a bit of whiskey to warm up. We sat down with a bottle of Johnny Walker and 2 shot glasses. I wasn't much of a drinker, but Steve certainly was. He chugged 3 shots in a minute. I sipped at mine, drinking half and putting it on the coffee table with a thunk.
Steve grunted, hissing through his open mouth for a moment. That's the good stuff, he said, slamming his chest as the burning liquor worked its way down. Steve looked up at me with a new sparkle in his eye. So, you want to know what happened to Will Lenning? Well, I'll tell you what nobody else knows, and I'll give you the whole story. I used to see him occasionally come down, drink, and talk. Well, we knew each other around here. I nodded, motioning to him to continue on. He seemed like a regular, upstanding guy. He kind of reminded me of you. A young guy trying to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, the cancer of the American dream. Well, he was up here for a couple of months, and I don't know. Everything seemed fine. We used to go skeet shooting occasionally and have some beer. We'd get together with a couple of other hunters who lived closer to town and sometimes play some poker. I never saw anything odd about the guy. I never could have predicted what happened to him. He heaved a long sigh at this, looking out the window at the sharp mountains with an expression of nostalgia. Well, what happened to him? I asked, encouraging him to go on. He started talking about seeing someone peeking in through his window at night. He talked about hearing sounds under his bed while laying in the dark, like diseased breathing and shuffling. He started keeping all the lights on in his cabin 24 hours a day. Steve leaned close to me. A glimmer of fear rippled across his pale, wrinkled face. He started to lose his mind. He started digging holes all over the place looking for something. Even in the middle of snowstorms, I would occasionally see him outside digging. It seemed like he never slept anymore. It was classic cabin fever if I ever saw it. It was only a few weeks later that I came over here concerned. I hadn't heard from him in a few days, which was unusual. I found the door hanging wide open, popped up in a chair, like the exact spot where you're sitting now. Will lay with a blast hole showing clear through his skull, a shotgun lying next to his feet. Next to him, I found a blood-stained diary opened to the middle of the page. The last entry, stained with blood spatter but still visible. I remembered leaning down and reading it. It was only a few sentences long. I glanced over at the bookshelf at the same diary, saying nothing. It said, "I see now what's going on. The twisted man is leading me to the truth. Today I will finally find it." And that was a suicide note? I asked, my heart hammering in my chest. He nodded. Yeah, I went into town, got some rangers to come back and check it out. Eventually they got cops and CSI there. They took all the stuff as evidence, including the diary, he said. Good riddance, I say. Reading something like that was never beneficial. Sometimes delusions spread like a virus, you know what I mean? I did, but I didn't say anything. I glanced back at the diary, its black leather cover gleaming like a crouching snake, and I wondered if the police took the diary as evidence. And if they did, how did it return here? You said he had a wife living with him too, I asked. Yeah, she went missing around the same time, he said. It's pretty bizarre. The cops thought that maybe she just moved away, but he shook his head grimly. As far as I knew, she was never seen again, and it was like she had just evaporated into thin air. After Steve left, I walked stiffly over to the bookshelf, taking down the diary. I flipped open through the pages. In the middle I found the last entry. Spatters of old, darkened blood were scattered over the page like raindrops. I found the suicide note and read the date, January 27th, 2015. Will Lenning had not lived long after he started seeing the twisted man. I wondered if my fate would be the same. The sun had started to set outside. I sat with the diary at the small circular kitchen table, eating some stewed venison and rice while reading the entries. In the end, Will says that the twisted man has been trying to guide him somewhere, that the twisted man has been trying to protect him from the rather great evil that was lurking around here. I scoffed, feeling a flash of anger at the stupidity of all this. His naivety led him to death, but then a flash of insight struck me like lightning. What if I was committing the same kind of stupidity? I should grab my gun and valuables and leave while I can. I could take off on the snowmobile and be in town within a few hours' time, but in my heart, I knew I would not. Something about the mystery of this beckoned me to stay, like a siren leading sailors to destruction. I was curious and knew I would not be leaving that night. I needed answers, and sadly, I would have to find them. I had fallen asleep with an empty bottle of beer in my hand. I sat in front of the TV, which only received satellite reception. Of course, no cable or phone lines were threading their way through the forest. All of my power came from stored solar energy in a generator. Since I rarely watched TV and only really used it to cook or heat water for bathing, the energy produced was sufficient even in winter. I needed its sound, mindless flashing of light and colors, and canned laughter tonight. Though, it seemed to drive away the creeping, suffocating presence like a candle. I woke suddenly. The TV flashed with static, the repetitive hissing of the white noise spit from the speakers like thousands of snakes. I glanced up at the clock and it was 3:33 a.m. I looked around the dark cabin, confused for a long moment. I didn't understand what had woken me so abruptly. The satellite had not gone out, even with the howling winds and freezing hail of the Alaskan winter. The TV started flickering as if the static were rising upwards. Black lines traced their way horizontally across the screen. The hissing deepened into a gurgle, and for a second, I thought I heard the faint words behind the white noise. I thought I heard breathing, slow and diseased, like the death gasp of a drowning man. A black line rose across the TV and an image appeared. The cabin was suddenly silent, except for the shrieking, wintry wind outside. I leaned close to the screen, confused as to what the freak I was looking at. It looked like a live camera feed of a room. As I took in the details, I realized it was my cabin. I saw myself in the chair, leaning close to the screen. I raised my hand and the miniature version of me did the same thing. Ice water seemed to drip down my spine as waves of dread coursed through my body. "What the freak is this?" I whispered, looking back to where the camera should be. But there was nothing there. It was just a coarse wooden ceiling in the corner. I turned back to the screen and nearly screamed. The TV showed a pale, naked man crouching directly behind my chair. With jerky movements, he rose his broken spine, twisting and shivering. A hissing voice rang out from the speakers. It spoke as if it had dirt writhing maggots in its throat.
"He's a killer, the shadow of death,"
it gurgled.
"Many have fallen, many lie buried across this forest. You will be next. He is watching you."
Long broken fingers with blackened nails reached out to touch my shoulders. I jumped out of the chair, stumbling back as I spun in terror. My back smashed into the TV and it fell into the floor, shattering. Explosion of light popped in, and then in those movements before the darkness descended on me like a blanket, I thought I glimpsed a pale, sunken face with rotted blackened eyes peeking out from behind the tree. I turned on every light in the cabin, but there was no sign of the twisted man in or around the cabin. I knew I had to get out of there, though. I thought about the warning that the voice had spoken. If the creature wanted to attack me, then why hadn't it just killed me while I was asleep? None of it made any sense. Who was watching me? The twisted man? And if he was, why warn me? Perhaps it's some sort of psychological warfare, I thought to myself. Possibly the twisted man was simply playing with me. Thoughts raced through my head at 1,000 miles an hour as I threw on snow pants and got some couple heavy sweaters on and coats. I covered up my entire body as much as I could. I wanted to prevent frostbite at all possible. I had made up my mind to flee. There was no snowstorm tonight, though the entire landscape was blanketed with deep, fresh snow, and I knew the wind chill would be like an ice blade whipping against my skin. Traveling in the middle of the night in temperatures that might reach negative 30 degrees was hazardous. Steve had been right, after all. Alaska had the highest missing persons rate of any state, and many of them were never found, their bodies likely frozen solid in the deep snow dozens of miles away from the nearest town. I grabbed my shotgun, jumped on my snowmobile, and headed to Steve's cabin. I hoped to wait until sunrise and figure out what to do next, but fate would take the decision out of my hands. I felt like eyes were watching me as I drove along the narrow, winding deer trail. The boughs of the evergreens reached into the path like greedy hands, grabbing at my coat and legs. More than a couple of times I thought I saw a pale, naked figure standing in the snow, but it had always gone when I turned to look. I sighed in relief when Steve's place appeared in the distance. I could see the lights twinkling through the small windows of his log cabin. I pulled up next to his door, looking down. I saw 2 pairs of footprints, one smaller than the others. I found it odd but shrugged it off. The snowmobile cut out a sucking gurgle. I knocked on the door a few hard times. Steve appeared after a few moments, groggy and half-dressed. He blinked slowly as he looked me up and down. His wrinkled face fell into a frown. "Steve, I need a favor," I said quickly. "Something weird is happening in my cabin. Can I stay here until morning? Until maybe I can get to town or something? I can't stay at my place tonight. I just can't." He nodded, yawning and motioning me to come in. "You can sleep on the couch, I guess," Steve said. "Put that shotgun somewhere safe though, boy." He had a partitioned bedroom in his cabin. It was significantly larger than my one little bedroom cabin, though it still had a joint kitchen, living room, small bedroom, and bathroom. He pointed to a well-worn couch in the corner and gave me an apathetic wave as he stumbled back into his bedroom, slamming the door. I couldn't sleep though. I tiptoed around the room looking at Steve's bookshelf. He had a strange taste in books. Lots of Anne Rule and all kinds of weird true crime. I saw a dozen books about Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Richard Chase, Herbert Mullen, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Richard Ramirez in the collection. A large black binder stood at the end, unlabeled and worn-looking. It reminded me of that leather-bound diary for a second, and my heart dropped. But logically, I knew this had to just be a coincidence. Yet still I pulled out the binder, my curiosity piqued. What I saw inside filled me with dread and horror. Countless news clippings covered the length of it. The first clipping was from nearly 20 years before, about a woman who went missing in the Alaskan forest while hiking. A later one confirmed that her body was never found and that her family was still hoping that she might turn up alive somewhere. A reward was offered for any information, it said. And every page after that was more of the same. Missing woman, murdered prostitute, missing man, no leads. I kept flipping through until I found clippings about Will Lenning's suicide and the sudden disappearance of his wife. In the article about the suicide, Steve used a red marker to scrawl, "Ha ha," next to it. I heard the click of a gun being cocked from behind me. I froze as Steve's voice traveled across the room like a whisper. "How do you like my work, my friend?" he asked, his tone pleasant and mocking. I still held the binder of horrors tightly in my hands as I stared open-mouthed at this man I thought I knew. "It's you? You killed Will and his wife, and all the other women?" Everything felt as unreal as it could, like if I were stuck in some sort of dream. Steve's grin spread across his face, but his blue eyes stayed cold and dead. "Yes. Well, she was cheating on him with me anyways. Just another whore, They always get what's coming to them in the end," he hissed with hatred oozing from his voice. "It's too bad I just killed another slut tonight. I was planning on saving you for later. The urge isn't too bad yet right now. After all, it comes in cycles, you see. It comes in waves." I saw a glimmer of pale, naked flesh writhing behind Steve. With jerky movements, the twisted man came up behind him. I said nothing, just watching the wide-eyed horror in amazement. "You need help, man," I whispered. Steve laughed. "Help? The only help they give people like me is a needle in the arm. You know that. That's why it's important to cover your tracks." The twisted man ran along, broken fingers across Steve's neck. Steve gave a strangled cry and jumped. He spun around screaming. I glanced over at my shotgun next to the couch. I jumped for it, and Steve turned back to me, firing his pistol twice. The first bullet soared high above me, raining wooden splinters down on my head, but the second ripped into my leg. A cold, burning pain ran like fire up my shin. I screamed in agony and battle fury as I grabbed the shotgun, spinning and firing. Steve's head exploded as the slug ripped through his brain. His forehead collapsed like a smashed melon as bone splinters and blood sprayed the wall behind him. The twisted man stood there hunched over, grinning at me. It felt weird. I started to feel more warm, blood gushing from my leg as I stared back at this thing, breathing harder. I wondered if I was dying. You weren't after me after all, I asked. You were after Steve. But the Twisted Man said nothing. After a long moment, he slinked back into the shadows of the bedroom and disappeared. As night crawled toward morning, I thought back to the Twisted Man's words through the TV, suddenly understanding everything. He is the killer, the shadow of death. Many have fallen, many lie buried across this forest. You will be next. He is watching you. He hadn't been trying to hurt me at all. He had been trying to warn me. He had probably tried to warn Will Lenning and his wife, too. I wrapped my leg in gauze, gritting my teeth. The wound looked puckered and deep, but I knew I could still move my foot. The bullet had gone through clean, and, luckily enough, I poured alcohol on it, screaming in pain as it burned its way through my skin. After rummaging through Steve's bathroom, I found some prescription painkillers and swallowed a handful of them with some beer. I knew I would need the opiate high to get through the pain of riding into town with a mutilated leg. As the sun finally rose, I made my way outside the blood-stained floors of the cabin to my snowmobile. Before I left, I glanced back at the horrid place, the scene of so much torment and death. In the open doorway, the Twisted Man stood, his back hunched, his rotted lips grinning at me, his hand lifted into the air with jerky movements, almost like it was waving. I waved back, started the engine, and headed into town. For a little backstory, Daniel was my childhood best friend from my neighborhood, and he lived in the building next to mine in the year of 1993, if I remember correctly. But we all called him Dan for short. This is his story, and he swears it's totally true. Since Dan was 8 or 9 years old, his mother, his stepfather, and he moved to a small neighborhood in a city in South America, which is located in a valley and is surrounded by a mountain and woods on all sides. The neighborhood was on the east side of the city on a dead-end street of a closed neighborhood, but there were a lot of green areas all around it, such as small hills with big and small trees, plants, flowers, grass, 2 parks, and a sports court. When Dan and his family moved to the neighborhood, he was very happy because when they were getting there in his mom's car, he could see lots of places where he could play in and explore. So as a kid, that was a very exciting thing. Even though the hills, woods, and plants that surrounded Dan's new neighborhood looked really nice during the day, and while the sun was up, they looked very dark and creepy at night, and he thought they were really scary. He felt an ominous presence from those woods at night. At that age, Dan was afraid of many things, like the dark, the woods, wolves, black dogs, cats, spiders, sharks, you name it. Just like me, and this was because he was a total mama's boy. And at 5 years old, what do you expect? When Dan and I met for the first time, we were both playing in the park while our babysitters were watching us, and talking to each other. We immediately bonded and became friends, because we had a lot of things in common. We started talking about our favorite TV shows and movies such as Star Wars, Dragon Ball Z, the X-Men cartoons, and Ninja Turtles, among many others. So, we used to play by pretending we were superheroes or some sort of cartoon character while running around, using the merry-go-round, the slides, the swings, and funny enough, we both had plastic lightsabers. So we fought as if we were Jedis or Ninja Turtles, but we never stayed in the park once the sun went down either, because our sisters did not let us, or we were just too scared, honestly. However, Dan was not my only friend in the neighborhood. I introduced him to my other friends who lived in my building and other buildings and houses. Their names were the following: Eliza, Diego, JP, Mike, Laura, and Gerard. All of us were around the same age, and we all became great friends as the months went by, because almost every afternoon we played sports, played in the park, trick-or-treated, had water balloon fights, played Nintendo together, climbed the hills and woods behind our buildings during the day, and even did everything together. The neighborhood kids liked to joke around by saying that the woods behind the buildings were haunted. At that time, we played hide and seek or cops and robbers, so we ran around the street until 7 p.m.,
because that was our curfew, and we had to do our boring homework after that. But Dan and I went to bed late at night in secret while we talked quietly on the phone. That night, it was like 9 or 10 p.m. I think, Dan asked me the following. "Did you watch X-Men today?" "Yeah, dude, of course. I would not miss it for the world. Did you see the fight against Apocalypse and the Four Horsemen?" "Yeah, dude. That fight was awesome. I loved it. But talking about something else, have you heard some creepy noises behind your building at night?" "Nah, bro, I'm a deep sleeper, so I usually black out." "Wow, I wish I was that lucky. You know, I usually can hear footsteps in those woods at night, and I also sleepwalk sometimes. Well, I think it's time for me to go to sleep. See you tomorrow. Take care, bro." "Sure thing, man. Talk to you tomorrow. Take care." Dan hung up his favorite hamburger-shaped phone, sat down in bed, grabbed an old fantasy book about dragons that was on his nightstand, and started reading it until he began to close his eyes and doze off. He fell into a deep sleep, and was now dreaming, or so he thought. In his dream, Dan could hear the crickets in the forest, but was woken up by some strange steps walking around the forest and the leaves crunching beneath him, or as if some person or animal was walking in the woods. There are a lot of cats in the neighborhood, so he thought it was one of those cats potentially, maybe a possum or an owl. All of a sudden, he heard a low whisper that beckoned him and said, "Daniel, it's Professor X. The X-Men need your help. Come to the woods and help us." This strange, but yet familiar voice was very similar to the professor's voice from his favorite cartoon, and it sounded like it was right outside of his window. Since he was a naive and innocent child, he decided to get out of bed, put on his jacket and boots, took his glasses, got out of his apartment, and went to the ground floor. Once he was on the ground floor, he walked to his building's parking lot. He felt a little cold, so he rubbed his shoulders with his hands. The voice kept calling out to him, "Help the X-Men, Dan." Somehow, he felt extremely attracted to this voice, like metal to a magnet, because he could not get it out of his head. He took a small leap to get on top of a small hill. He then felt very scared, but kept walking into the dark and creepy woods. While he was walking, he heard other footsteps and leaves crunching beside his. He felt like these steps were approaching his position. At that moment, he stopped walking so he could hear the steps more clearly, since he thought it was some crazy person or an animal that was insane enough to walk in the woods in the middle of the night. There are a lot of cats in this neighborhood, like I said, so Dan thought it was one of those cats. Maybe it was some other sort of animal, but then he heard a noise that sounded like a roar. He thought it sounded very similar to those dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. He had recently seen that movie in theaters, so it was the closest thing he could think of. Suddenly, he heard fast steps from somebody or something running in his direction. Dan broke out of his trance. He looked around, and his little kid's mind felt so terrified that he passed out, and fortunately, when he hit the ground, his body was positioned between a tall tree and a large boulder. So, he barely heard how this trickster creature ran next to him, circled his location, and then it smelled the air in order to get a scent, but he guessed it decided to leave. Dan assumed he had passed out for several hours because he was woken up by the sound of a woodpecker, cicadas, and birds that were on a nearby tree. The heat and glare from the sun in his face woke him up. He rubbed his eyes, opened them, and looked all around him. He was in shock and horrified when he looked at his Spider-Man watch and saw that it was 6 a.m. He had woken up in the middle of the forest. He thought he was going to wake up in his bed because he was dreaming, but he had sleepwalked into the forest in order to follow that beckoning voice. He saw his clothes were full of fallen leaves, so Dan quickly stood up, brushed the leaves from his arms and legs, and ran away from that creepy forest, which looked normal during the day. He climbed down the forest until he got into his parking lot. He ran to his building's door, opened it, ran to the elevator, and he saw himself in the mirror and could not believe that happened to him. Dan got to his apartment door, opened the door silently, tiptoed inside the apartment's hallway, and saw that thankfully his mother and father had not waken up yet. So, he went to bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what occurred last night. He completely believed his parents when they told him not to listen to strangers, especially if they are in the middle of a dark and creepy forest. So, Dan had many questions and thought to himself, how did this creature imitate Professor X's voice? How did it know he would listen to it? How did it know he loved the X-Men cartoon? Maybe he would never find out,
Or maybe he would. Who knows? This took place probably in November of 2022. Before I get into it, you need to know it's been a running joke that my cat is a skinwalker because she mimics human speak, walks upright, and just has a vibe that she's far more intelligent than she should be. She's only 4 pounds and knows how good she has it for sure. It was before dawn. I was asleep, being kept up all night by a weird screaming in the fields outside of my yard. Honestly, I thought it was a fox or something at first, but it ended in a way that a deer call would, like the elk in Skyrim. Everyone heard and reported it, but nobody had found and trapped any sort of animal that could be responsible. The theory was that one of my neighbors was illegally keeping foxes for the pet trade on her farm, but investigations proved she had all her animals legally and foxes were not among them. So, I am conked out when suddenly I hear my cat meowing and screaming outside my door, clawing to enter my room. Remember when I said that she can mimic speech? Her meows often sound like human words. It honestly kinda sounds like a child crying. I sighed and pulled a pillow over my head to drown it out some, as I knew damn well she had all the fresh food she could want. Plus, I just cleaned the litter box before going to bed. The clawing continued with that all too familiar fury and panic my cat contains. I swear you would think I abandoned her somewhere. When the clawing failed, she started making the I am gonna puke sounds. It honestly sounds like a drunk person groaning. I swear, this cat makes every annoying sound she can to get what she wants. That got me up pretty quickly. If she's going to throw up, I knew she would do so in the center of the carpet where my parents were sure to step. I sat up in bed, blindly groping for a house coat and slippers, only to see that my cat was already in the room. I had not left my room all night, so I was pretty sure she was still out there. So how the hell did she get in my room? She looked at me momentarily and I saw both fury and terror in her eyes. I said her name in a whisper. Not even I could hear, and she squeaked at me, or maybe even whimpered. That's when the meows came again from outside my door. Louder, longer, meaner. I grabbed my now snarling cat and pulled her under the bed covers with me while silently praying to every god and goddess I knew. Then the meows changed from meows to the sound of some long-gone, very much beloved dog that I had a long time ago, but it was whimpering, complete with his claws clacking on the floor. That was the final straw for me. I rolled out of bed, onto the floor and loudly said, "You are not welcome here. Leave now." My cat snarled again and threw herself at the door with everything she had. Some growls returned, but everything fell silent except for our front door slamming shut. I pulled on the house coat, opened my door, only to be met by my father in the kitchen. He asked me if I had slammed the door and then realized I couldn't have had if he had seen me exiting my room. My mom joined us and asked what happened, and we all said we didn't know. I told them my cat was with me because they always blamed her and me for everything that went wrong in the house. My dad was beyond furious. He had been woken up earlier, way earlier than needed. He stormed to my brother's room figuring he'd been out late and came home drunk, but my brother was sound asleep, and a note left by my friend who brought him home was saying he was too drunk to walk himself in. On his bedside, he probably had been home since about 12:30 due to the note. However, the last line made my blood run cold. "I left your brother in his room and left right away. I couldn't find his keys to lock up behind me. I also let your cat into the house. I think you guys might have forgot that she was outside." After this event, I blessed our house several times, and thankfully, nothing seemingly has returned. But every time I hear my cat, I have to make sure she isn't already in the room with me before I go looking. Sitting on the western side of the Missouri River is Omaha, Nebraska, a large metropolis that has been Nebraska's largest city for many years. It has witnessed many historical events throughout its almost 170 years. Like many cities, Omaha had many ethnic neighborhoods where new immigrants settled down with people of their kind. A section of town known for its meatpacking plants, appropriately named South Omaha, became the home of many Eastern Europeans, Poles, Czechs, Germans, Lithuanians, Slavics,
Croatians, and more all resided here. However, many of these slaughterhouses closed as years passed and the area changed forever. A few remain, but the days of massive feedlots are gone. Growing up here, I was always told stories about South Omaha and its past. Many old buildings remained to act as silent monuments to the old days and often mesmerized me in my youth. I wanted to see these old buildings. Some old slaughterhouses, factories, even old breweries that Omaha was once famous for. One building stood out to me though. One of the old slaughterhouses lay close to the train tracks that cut South Omaha in half. This building was massive, with almost 5 stories. It was very long, about 3 complete football fields wide. Built of brick and steel, this old building was a testament to the people of this city. However, I heard it would soon be demolished and was instantly saddened by the news. Hearing about urban exploration over the internet always piqued my interest, but I was always too nervous about trespassing. Since this building was set to be demolished, I decided to go and see it before it became a parking lot. I set out of my truck on a fantastic fall evening to see this behemoth of a building. I brought my heavy LED mag light and dressed in light hiking gear to avoid looking conspicuous. The slaughterhouse lay near the train tracks in a more deserted area of South Omaha. Around it were other buildings adorned with the same red and white brick that this building also wore. Many tall grasses and empty lots surrounded the building, all the while a chain-link fence surrounded the entire complex that was the slaughterhouse. I was prepared for this and parked some distance away on a side street near a garage. Walking towards the building, I became aware of its immense size. It indeed was magnificent and occupied a mammoth amount of space. The fence did not feature a barbed wire top so that I could climb over. The minute I stepped onto the ground after the fence, I felt a strange sensation from inside me. Nervousness, fright, I guess both if I had to really give a guess. Whatever it was, it remained with me as I proceeded on. I approached a door with a window on the side of the building. Whatever logo or name had been affixed to it before had long worn off and the glass was covered in dirt and grime. I tried the handle and it would not budge. I felt the door loose and figured it could probably be opened with some force. I eventually got it open after bashing my shoulder into it, accidentally breaking the lock. Oh well, I thought. It was going to be torn down anyway. I entered the slaughterhouse and flicked on my flashlight. As I stepped into the pitch blackness, I was greeted with a large open room that featured lots of decrepit machinery undoubtedly used for meat processing. The walls and floor were tile, easy cleaning, shouldn't be too long to do that. Long conveyor belts were shaking and snaking through the room strewn with dust and cobwebs. Control stations, desks, and more surrounded me. None of this, though, looked like it had been touched for many years. I made my way through the mess of machinery and dust until I reached a pair of double doors. I pushed them open slightly into another large room. But as I did, something changed. It suddenly became frigidly cold, which was odd because it was only 65 degrees out, so sure it wasn't like hot, but it wasn't cold either, and there was no wind at all. It felt like winter had come into this room alone. I shivered but pressed on. The next room was what I presumed to be the killing floor. It had a significant main pathway for the cattle to move through, and then conveyor belts to carry them to the next station to be dressed. Now, living near the stockyards all my life, I have become used to the smells that emanate from this part of town. The smell that hit me as I browsed this room was on a different level, though. It was not a familiar smell of cow poop or burnt meat, but of death, decay, and disease. It was otherworldly. I have read and heard about rotting smell lending itself to wendigos, skinwalkers, and the like, so I was on edge. I tried to convince myself that it was just a dead animal or something more reasonable. I continued to walk through the next room with an absolutely uneasy feeling. Suddenly, a sound like no other shook the room with great ferocity. It was the bellow of a bull. It did not sound normal, though. It sounded like a cry. This was incredibly loud, shrieking like it was about to charge. I looked around quickly to find the scream's source, but I couldn't find a damn thing. I continued to move through the room, finally reaching the other end. Bright, shiny tile lined this side of the room, with more conveyor belts, large plastic bins on wheels. As I closed in on these bins, I was in a state of absolute shock. These bins were full of bones. They were massive bones, obviously from cows. How could these still be here? This place has been out of operation for close to 40 years. The bones were still bloody and smelled fresh. I was about to start freaking out at this point, honestly. I looked down and saw the floor was covered in blood from these bins. I quickly stepped back and nearly slipped on the tile. As I did this, I noticed a light from one of the doors near my end. 2 red eyes appeared in the dark, and I leaned closer to see what it was. Suddenly, another loud bellow rang through the room, and those eyes got closer. I could hear hooves on the tile floor. I sprinted from my spot, bolted through the door, and got to the other side of the room. Once through the door, I ran down a hall lined with shiny tile. I followed this hallway, hoping to find my way out. I expected the bull to find me, or maybe just leave me alone entirely, but I was still determined. I reached the end of the hallway and approached the doorway with rubber flaps across it like you would see at a butcher shop. I pressed through and turned to the right, but stopped dead. A faint red light bulb exposed a workstation with multiple men cleaning a cow. They wore long white smocks, helmets, goggles, and rubber boots. One was spraying down the cow, the other was cutting a part off, and the last was moving some bones to a bin. I couldn't believe my eyes. How is this possible? Did some meat packing still take place? That couldn't be possible, there's no way. As I stepped more into the room, I heard something unusual. They weren't speaking English. It sounded almost Eastern European, maybe Polish. It had to be. I remember my grandparents speaking Polish to me occasionally. With my grandfather being full-blooded Polish, I was still in awe what I was seeing. I needed to get by these guys to leave, so I started to move past them. I don't know how, but they heard me, and all turned to look. Everyone stopped what they were doing. 3 bespectacled men stared at me with only the dim red light exposing them. I froze in my tracks and knew I was trespassing. One man shouted something in Polish to me and began moving my way. The others followed. I fled to the other door and sprinted as fast as possible down the hallway. I heard their footsteps behind me, but their gear must have slowed them down somewhat, because I outran them. Soon, I found an exterior door and bashed it open. I was on the other side of the slaughterhouse, but quickly found the road on the west end of the lot, leading me back to the truck. Eventually, I did feel safer outside, now that I could catch my breath, walk around, and hide. While doing so, I took one more glance towards the building. My legs froze at what I saw. I saw the 3 men looking at me through an open truck dock. They looked the same, except they had red, glowing eyes. I began to run now, losing my mind in fear. As I saw my truck up the road, another bull bellow echoed through the street and hurt my ears. How could this be happening? I hopped in my car and peeled out of there. Looking in my rear view mirror, I couldn't see anything, but I was forever shaken by what I found. Never again would I explore the abandoned buildings, especially where many animals were killed. What did those men want with me? What would I have done? What was that creature? I have no idea. After doing a bunch of research online, reading a bunch of stuff on Reddit, and even listening to shows like Swamp Dweller, I just kind of think it might have been some sort of skinwalker. I don't know.
Hey Swamp, it's me again, Midori. This happened a couple of nights ago. So unlike some of the other things I have sent you, the details, at least those that I know, are still fresh in my mind. So for some context, this happened at a park called Stolsoft Park. The whole thing is inside of my city. I would say it is maybe a square mile in total area. Sorry, I'm not too familiar with acres. It is mostly forest, with a playground facing the street on the northern end. The playground, along with the north and south entrances, are elevated hill streets, so the forest gradually goes downward, meeting at a valley in the center. The playground is bordered by a forest on two sides. The swing set, where I was, is maybe 10 feet away from the fence separating one side of the playground from the forest. I'm sorry if that is confusing. I should say I usually go swing there anytime between 9 at night and midnight, mainly because I like being the only person in the park. I am not some curmudgeon who does not like kids or anything. I just prefer less crowded places in general. So, on this night, I believe it was around 11-something, when I hear shuffling behind the fence. This is not unusual at all, and I don't react in any way. Maybe 5 minutes later, I heard it again, and it sounded like something approximately human-sized. My first thought was a mountain lion. Despite the park posting signs warning of mountain lion activity, I have never actually seen one here. They do not worry me anyway, because a mountain lion will not usually attack or even really care about a human if you don't do something stupid like mess with their young. I have encountered them elsewhere. They generally mind their own business. My next thought was a creeper, and I mentally prepared to jump off and run to my car. At this point, I was looking at the fence. On that night, the moon was not shining per se, but it was casting its glow, giving minimal visibility. At 10 feet away, however, I would at least be able to see movement, especially of this being's assumed size. As I was mulling it over in my head, I heard not exactly what you could call a growl, but almost a moaning, I guess. It lasted about 5 seconds. Then I heard something moving away. The weird thing was, the movement came from quite a ways off, in the same direction, and the vocalization came from right at the fence, 10 feet away from me. Now at this point, the sensible thing to do would be to just leave, but having just happened, I was dumbfounded and just continued swinging for another 30 seconds or so. And then, of course, it got more strange. As I was swinging, I saw a flashlight in the distance, near where the playground hits the streets. This is maybe 60 or 70 feet from me. With obstacles such as play structures and other things in the way, my first thought that it was a police officer or something of the sort. The playground technically is closed, and they all are because of the corona situation. But I've swung at parks after they've been closed for years, and if the police even care about things like that, they've never even bothered me. The guy came a bit closer, but he is moving at an angle towards me in the general sense, but moving at an angle. As in, if you envision the area as a clock, with me at 6, he started at 12, and he is moving towards 7. Sorry, that is the only way I can really describe it. 10 feet from the swing set in the opposite direction of the fence, there's a 20-foot by 20-foot metal overhang, with one of those fishnet pattern tables for picnics. I hopped off the swing and crouched behind it. In the day, this would be a completely useless hiding place, but at night, a person hiding behind it would just look like a part of a mass of shadow. I watched as it approached, and while I could not make out any details or colors, I could see that he was dressed almost like a hunter from the show Supernatural. He looked to be wearing baggy pants, a vest and a hat, the most common kinda hat with a duckbill on the front, the kind they sell at lids. There looked to be things strapped on his arms and legs. Mind you, visibility was unbelievably bad, and I may have mistaken many of these details. He was carrying a flashlight, aimed at the ground in front of him. On his opposite hand, it looked like he had some sort of stick, like a gymnastics baton or something. All I know was the general shape. It occurred to me that if this guy fancied himself a hunter, then a pale girl swinging at midnight is probably the worst thing you can be. Either way, this situation now seemed potentially dangerous. If this person came close, I decided to run for the far fence, leading into the forest. Note that between me and my car, despite the small size of the forest, finding a person hiding in it would be impossible at night. Even with a flashlight, I am completely familiar with the forest. I am currently 27, and I have been coming here since I was 7 or 8 years old. Even in complete darkness, I could navigate it well enough to hide if I had to. As I crouched down, the person stopped briefly, then continued down into the forest entrance. That is basically the ending of our encounter. I waited for a few minutes, and then I tried to see if I could still see it. I am not sure if the two events were related at all. As far as the noise I heard, I know what mountain lions sound like. The only other fauna in the park are deer, squirrels, and insects. I honestly do not know if this was a skinwalker or anything like that. All I heard was the sound. There was no smell, and I did not get necessarily a terrible feeling from that person with the flashlight, even though they were dressed weird. Also, I don't think this forest would be big enough to house something like that, but maybe it could be just big enough for something to stop by for a few days. We do have a good-sized forest farther up in the mountains, not too far away, called Hubbard Park. You probably have to travel about 20 minutes through the suburbs to get there, but I'm not sure that it would be impossible for a skinwalker to bounce between these two locations. Do you guys think I saw a skinwalker? Do you guys think I possibly saw somebody hunting a skinwalker? I don't know.
Hello, my name is Heron, and I am a BBC Earth Nat Geo photographer and cinematographer for various documentaries, including Ice on Fire for HBO and Leonardo DiCaprio. A few years ago, something extraordinary happened to my shooting partner Gavin Heffernan and me at Vermilion Cliffs in Arizona. We had privately told the story to friends, but didn't figure making it public would make much sense until a friend of mine sent one of your videos about Skinwalker Ranch, which echoed almost similar things that happened to us. Gavin and I have specialized in night sky photography and have covered all 50 American states and Canadian provinces, spending full nights in most remote places. However, of over 1,000 of those nights we spent shooting after spending thousands of nights out there shooting, we have never had anything like this happen. We made our way to White Pocket inside of Vermilion Cliffs, a fantastic collection of swirling white lithified sandstone. We decided to spend a night there shooting time lapses for a BBC Earth short film, and were the only ones there that night. We set up our 6 cameras and let them roll, and decided to get some sleep. We set a timer for 1 a.m. to wake up and move our cameras to different places so that we could shoot another set of shots. When I turned, I saw lights that initially looked like headlights but made no sense as they were in the direction of the park, where there were neither roads or trails. I pointed it out to Gavin, and we looked at it for quite some time. The more it appeared that it wasn't headlights but possibly a headlamp of a hiker. However, there were no trails in that area, and we figured perhaps a hiker got lost and was wandering around towards us, as they may have spotted us with their headlamps. We decided to stick around and wait, as we were worried it might be someone who might take our cameras. We looked and the light was getting closer, and when it got close enough that it was bright enough to reflect the white rocks at some point, but then it suddenly stopped. We sat there and waited and nothing. A couple of minutes later, the lights were back but much further away, and there was no way a hiker could have backtracked a few miles in a matter of 5 minutes. That disturbed us enough that we didn't return to our tents but stayed there to sleep next to the camera. This was a bizarre event, but we would have shrugged it off if something hadn't happened the following night. We drove to another park and hiked into a famous rock structure area called The Wave. Only about 20 people are allowed in a day via a permit, so we figured if we stayed overnight 3 miles away from the parking lot, we wouldn't get any lights flashing around from cars or hikers. We could shoot the night sky videos there. It's a highly dark area at night. You can barely see your hand in front of your face. We did the same as the previous night, set up cameras and slept with the alarm set to 1 a.m. Unlike White Pocket, The Wave is situated amongst canyons that are highly echoey, and you can very clearly hear even the smallest of rocks roll half a mile away. Footsteps or any other sounds are easily heard. When we woke up, we returned to where we had left our cameras and set up new shots. However, when I went back to the spot I had left one of the cameras, it was missing. We left it there in the dark with nobody around. I frantically looked for it all around and nothing. I suspected I may have forgotten where I exactly put it, but I was fairly certain that it was there. I went to Gavin and asked him if he recalled where I put it, and he said he was sure it was where I was. We searched for it more, covering the whole area. Then we stood there, quiet, trying to see if we could hear the sound of a camera shutter clicking somewhere in the dark, but there was nothing. We agreed to go back to sleep and look for it in the morning when suddenly a loud thud reverberated through the canyon. We pointed our lights and walked in the direction of the sound. It was my camera, fallen over. There was no wind, no sounds of animals we would have easily heard, and no people. The camera was still clicking, taking shots, something we also would have heard when we were sitting there earlier listening for sound. We were beside ourselves as to how this could have happened because we set up our tripod legs wide to anticipate a possible bump of the camera by just about anything. But in this case, the camera would have had to been pushed over or dropped by something. I remember Gavin turning to me and saying, "I'm an atheist, but this one's making me wonder." Following morning, I dropped Gavin back at his car. He went toward Los Angeles and I went to the city of Page, Arizona, where I planned to do a night of shooting in the Waterholes Canyon. That's just underneath State Highway 89 and about 5 miles south of the town. Tried to put last night's event in the back of my head as I had to shoot alone this night. I was still in the Vermilion Cliffs area, but this was just outside the park and I was close to the town, so unlike the last 2 nights in a completely remote location, this was underneath a highly utilized bridge of a busy state road. I parked and went into the canyon to scout things out in daylight. I wanted to grab a shot of the bridge from inside the canyon, looking up at the night sky above it. As I made my way down into the canyon, hiking down a trail, I started to smell something strange. The closer I got to the canyon area underneath the bridge, the more I smelled it. When I got there, I spotted next to the bridge support structures what appeared to be a dead dog. I got closer, and it was clear the smell was coming from there. I then realized it wasn't a dog, but a coyote, and it was lying. Not as it fell from above, but as if someone had set it down. However, the disturbing part was that the coyote was missing its bottom jaw and its tongue, and it was sliced off, like it was missing. Not ripped off, but sliced off, with precision. I left and never went back again. I didn't think about this much until I watched your episode about Skinwalker Ranch, and now it's really making me think. I experienced what I can only imagine is an otherworldly occurrence when I moved to the Sierra Nevadas about 4 years ago. I'd been living in the South Lake of Tahoe, California area for many years and spent a decent amount of time in the outdoors, hiking, camping, and generally enjoying the beautiful place I was lucky enough to call home. Now, I don't get scared quickly. I'm used to being by myself, and I carry weapons everywhere I go. Being a 5'2" and 110-pound female, I go out of my way to be sure I can protect myself. Many people in the outdoor community told me about being careful on the trails in the forest. I usually do these things alone, save for my trustworthy, though somewhat cowardly dog. But I had never felt as uncomfortable, confused, and downright afraid as I did in my apartment one night, when I finally relocated away from Tahoe to Reno, Nevada. I had moved to Reno to escape the isolation of living in Lake Tahoe, and though it is only about 60 miles away, it felt like a whole different world. Now the city itself isn't necessarily huge, and I was living in the north end of town, surrounded by high desert foothills and somewhat sparsely populated compared to more of the urban city center. Still, I never felt like I was out in the boonies or anything. I lived alone with my pup, and we liked our little apartment. So to set the scene here, it was early fall and the sun was beginning to develop at a much earlier time of day, which was exemplified by the fact that the city sits in a valley, so sunset seems to approach much faster than in other places in northern Nevada. My apartment sat just above street level with a window in the kitchen next to my stacked washer and dryer that looked out into an alley, maybe about 10 feet above the small street beside the small fourplex building. It was dark outside, and I was alone with my dog doing laundry. My apartment layout was an open concept, and the living room/kitchen area was separated by a wall that had a vast space cut out into it so you could walk through and see each other. With the washer and dryer tucked around, and the aforementioned window to the left of that, with the openness of the space, the darkness outside, and the number of overall windows the apartment had, it almost felt like you were in a spotlight. If it was dark out and I had the lights on, it looked like I was living in a fishbowl or a terrarium. Anyone or anything could see right in. I made it a point to permanently close my blinds, save for the small window looking out to the alley. I didn't mind keeping those blinds open because I liked the fresh air, and someone would need a ladder to reach me if they had been determined enough. As I was removing the clothing from the dryer and turning to plop it on my couch to begin folding, I realized my dog was acting incredibly strange. He didn't want to cross the line, so to speak, from my living room to the kitchen, marked by a change from the carpet to tile. Though it was only a few steps, he seemed incredibly hesitant and began whining and burping out small, concerned woofs. At first, I just thought he was anxious. For whatever reason, he is known to be a bit of a weenie, but then out of nowhere, I sensed this immense and insurmountable feeling of dread and displacement. I turned my back to the washer, dryer, and small alley facing window. My dog sat facing me, almost looking past me, and his apparent anxiety and frustration began to build as I was asking him what was wrong. He started barking a whole alarm bark at this point, and as soon as he did, the sense that someone or something was observing me took over me and caused my blood to run cold. My logical response was someone was just watching me through the window, the only window that has open blinds, and the only window that anyone could see me through. So in one fell swoop, I reached for the overhead drawstring for the light and turned it off and faced the window, confronting whoever or whatever was intruding on my life. As soon as the light clicked off and the room was dark, I saw what I could only describe as a perfectly round light about the size of a small cantaloupe directly across from me on the other side of the window. It didn't glow like a lamp or a light though. Its edges were perfect and it didn't hover or vibrate or even move. At this point, I was too stunned to move, and my fight or flight response had engaged so quickly that I had no time to recognize or rationalize what I was seeing. I was looking at this thing, and it was looking back. I felt cold and confused. My hair was standing on end. My heart was racing. My dog had gone into complete freakout mode and was jumping and barking and generally causing a stir in the living room, as he could see all of this as well. The light seemed to now realize that I could see it, and it looked as if it backed away or at least grew more diminutive in size. It had moved to the right of the window now. It flickered twice and then disappeared. It didn't buzz away or fly away, and it didn't zoom out of vision. It was visible, not visible, and then just gone. As soon as I realized the light was not there anymore, I opened the window and poked my head out to see what was going on. Maybe someone was up at my window with a flashlight. Perhaps someone in the neighboring buildings had seen something and would be checking for themselves to try and solve this odd mystery. Nothing, not a soul, and what felt like deafening quiet was all I heard. I closed the window. As soon as I shut the window, I hear a solid 3 knocks on the larger window out front by the living room. As I mentioned before, those blinds were closed, and though from the outside looking in it's entirely clear someone was home because the lights were on in that room, no one could know it was me alone in my apartment, right? I wasn't expecting anyone over, and it was too late for solicitors. No one had any reason to be at my house then, and I was not going to open that door. My dog had rushed to the kitchen as soon as the light outside the window had disappeared, and then he was in what I can only describe full-on defense mode. Now my dog is an absolute wuss. I've seen him run from cats and get spooked by bags blowing in the street, and he generally stays by my side on hikes while we're camping, because normally he expects me to protect him. This pup seemed ready for war though. Hackles up, eyes alert, growling at the front window now. I stepped into the living room, grabbed my gun with one hand and keys with the other, and slinked back into the kitchen and out the back door to where my car was parked. I threw my dog in, started it up, and raced off to a restaurant across town where I ordered to-go food and ate in the front of my Subaru. We car camped in a Walmart parking lot that night. I returned to the apartment the following day, my laundry still on the couch with no apparent signs of anyone trying to enter the place. Everything seemed normal. I never experienced any disruption in that place ever again for the 1.5 years that I lived there afterward. I have no idea, to this day, what I experienced. It wasn't until I shared the story with some friends that I heard that knocking and the sense of being watched was somewhat common of a phenomenon to people who encounter skinwalkers. I live in Manchester, England. We have some nice woodland trails around here, but there are no Yosemite parks or Appalachian trails. They are a series of woodland walks with paths leading off into the woods, open fields, and reservoirs. It's nice for daytime strolls with your dog, but very creepy at night. One tea time, I decided to have a stroll to the reservoir to clear my head after work.
The trails were empty this day, and it was eerily quiet. As I walked along, I heard a stifled laugh behind me. I spun around, but nobody was there. Now, we don't really have bears in Manchester, so there was no chance of a grizzly jumping out at me or something. But a strange growling noise began to come from the bushes. I turned around again, and out of the shrubs on his back, propelling himself over the path into the opposite bushes, was a skinny, disheveled-looking, middle-aged man. He was growling like an animal, with a contorted face and wriggling arms. He was slowly making his way across the path on his back like a snake. I couldn't even scream, I was just absolutely scared. It was so surreal. As soon as he hit the opposite side of the path, I sprinted off, back into the direction I had come, heading for home. I heard a squeal, looked behind me, and he was now crawling on all fours like an animal, following me. I've never run as fast in my life till I got to the trail end and back onto the car park and road. I looked back, and he was still there. He was pawing at the ground with one hand and staring at me. I continued to run. Later that night, I asked my husband and my son to check out the trail to see if he was still there. He wasn't. That's the last time I did the Black Leech Trail alone. I don't know what that guy was doing, what his intentions were, and I don't really want to know. I am a young adult male with a pretty average build, and I live in the city on the West Coast. My neighborhood is kind of an odd one. People are out and about throughout the day and even into the night. One night, sometime around 8 p.m. last year, I decided to walk around my neighborhood. It had cold, crisp air that day, and it seemed like a good condition to walk around and not crack a sweat. I took the route on the outskirts of my neighborhood. There is a runoff that runs parallel to the city street with woods all around it. Thus, there are 2 roads and sidewalks that also run alongside the runoff, one for the neighborhood and one for the city. I walked on the sidewalk closest to the city street. In addition to the runoff, a hedge of bushes separates the runoff and the sidewalk. At the end of the runoff is a neighborhood park, but before that is a small bridge. You must cross over the runoff to get to the neighborhood street. In previous outings, I have noticed homeless people sleeping on the bridge, thereby blocking access to it. There is also an opening in the brush by the bridge where the homeless people sit and camp to get shade from the sun or rain. Now, this isn't to say that homeless people are scary, they're just human beings at the end of the day. I just mention this because it does sometimes feel a little unsafe. As I approached the bridge, I couldn't help but glance at the brush opening. To my relief, it was empty. I continued my walk, but nagging feelings kept compelling me to look back after I had crossed the bridge. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a figure, a silhouette turning the corner onto the bridge I had just left. The figure was male, wearing a baseball cap, undeniably about 6 feet tall or more, and incredibly skinny. They were also moving fast, like way too fast, so I decided to start booking it towards the park. As I reached the park, I realized I never heard any footsteps. I turned back and the figure had vanished in front of my eyes. The next thing I saw was a runner passing me, running over the bridge, and I didn't see or hear any reaction from the runner seconds afterward. And this was a woman now, somebody completely different from who I had just been seeing. That's when I concluded that it must have been my imagination or some sort of spirit that I must have disturbed somehow. Finally, I began to get more spooked because now I'm hearing whispering voices around me. I looked down and came to a haunting revelation. I had been listening to scary stories all my life. I had heard many stories about haunted bridges and the souls that could reside under them. And I believe that this bridge is haunted, with voices and spirits haunting the top and the bottom side of this bridge. I've never been back there at night since. I'm not really sure how to explain it other than there's some creepy stuff going on out in the woods sometimes. This happened Easter of last year. My husband's family owns an old farm with a large property with mountains, lakes, and woods. No one lives on the farm anymore, so we use it as a holiday residence. This is west in Norway, so fords and mountains and lots of red deer all over the place. No neighbors, and no animals except wild ones.
There are old ruins from the Viking Age about 500 meters from the house. Nearby the lake, much unknown history that I find every time I come here. But the forest on this property is incredibly eerie. I'm Norwegian, and my ex, the father of my kids, is Canadian. He's not much around anymore, and my daughter, who is 10, is very fond of horror movies. My son, 9, also likes a good scare. To help them not forget their Canadian culture, I told them about the Wendigo. This was in the car on our way to the west for Easter holiday. Since there was so much deer out there, I told them a story that I've read on the internet about a Wendigo mimicking kitten sounds. I told them that these Norwegian mountains are the same as the Appalachian before the continent split up, and that's maybe why they can be so eerie. Maybe there's some remnants of Wendigo left up here. The second day there, we cut down some small trees outside the house. The kids and I dragged the branches over a small field and tossed them down a hill. This hill is where the forest begins and also the path down to the lake. My husband was in the garage, the other direction, fixing the chainsaw. As we took a break by the tree line, my son, with the Wendigo story in mind, starts to make a special cartoonish cat meow that he thinks is funny into the forest. He kept going maybe 6 or 7 times, before I told him to knock it off and get back to helping us with the branches. We turned around, and then, out of nowhere in the silence of the woods, there was a very clear meow coming from the bottom of the hill. It sounded exactly like my son's voice, though. It wasn't my son. He was standing right in front of me, and I could see that he didn't make a single noise. We shrugged it off as someone hiking and answering the meowing, and I didn't want to scare the kids too much, at least not for real, and didn't feel like I needed to remind them that it's private land and nobody except us would be here, because the only walkable path is through the garden and small field. We got up to the garage, told my husband, and went inside for lunch. He was just like, well, I guess there's lots of spirits in these woods. And then we didn't talk about it again. He's a man of few words and not easily scared. He grew up on the farm and spent every vacation of his life here. He knows the land well and thinks it's incredibly mystical, but not quite scary. My husband actually reminded me of this meowing story in the car on the way to Easter this year, and we still can't figure out a rational explanation. So we've kind of just landed on it being a forest spirit, or maybe a very interesting fox. I went camping with my wife and stepdaughter the other night near Laguna Mountain in California. We were off the main road in a secluded route that seldom had cars passing by. No foot traffic through the area at all whatsoever. We heard a noise late during the night that honestly could be explained logically by something natural that we might not know about. However, my wife and I have both been losing sanity trying to understand what that noise could have been, or what could have made that noise so far out in the woods. The first occurrence of the noise occurred around midnight, and we can only describe it as a slow, deliberate, rhythmic nail scratching on the tensioned paracord straps that we were securing the tent with on the ground. Naturally, we thought it might have been a critter curious about the tent, but the slowness and the rhythm of the noise makes us believe otherwise, because critters like that generally scratch quickly and sounds more hasty, like they have something to do. The other conclusion that led us to believe it wasn't a critter was because of the fact that throughout the night, we actually did hear squirrels running around outside, curious of all of our stuff that was there. Now, why this detail is important? Because during that time leading up to the noise and the time after the noise, we heard absolutely no critters outside running up or away from the tent. Whatever was creating the noise was absolutely silent coming up into our tent. And eerily enough, it may have even been floating or something of that nature. We never saw any footsteps or any footprints or anything like that. We did hear it again at around 2 a.m. that same night, and during that specific episode, the noise seemed to have shifted from one corner of the tent to the other, closer to our heads, allowing us to even feel the vibration of the scratching reverberating throughout the floor of the tent. That's what leads me to believe that this was no sort of animal. I also believe that the paracord strips being so taut helped the tension vibrate even more, making this maybe even a little bit more pronounced for us to see, or feel, I should say.
We may have heard the noise again at a third time, but it seemed weaker the last time, and we eventually fell asleep. My wife and I are very disturbed when we think about this story. It honestly kept us awake most of the night on high alert. I don't even think I fell asleep until I saw the first sunrise. I'm gonna be honest, I would love to know if anybody in the swamp has any idea what this could be. It could just be something natural we could explain, but I like to think that there might be something more going on here.
I'm a park ranger, but I'm intentionally leaving my name and the park's name out of this post. The names of all those involved have been changed as well. I needed to get this story out there, but could not rely on conventional avenues. That's why I'm posting it here. I could lose my job or much worse, but this story has to be told. I owe it to Catherine. I arrived at the ranger station like any other day. I was given my section of the park to patrol. Unfortunately, the park is massive, and my section usually includes half of it, so there isn't much chance for strolls on the trails. I hopped in my work vehicle, a 10-year-old 4x4, and headed down to see if anyone needed assistance. It didn't take long to find someone. At the first campground, a man couldn't get his camper started. A quick jump got him rolling along. Next was a couple needing directions, then an overturned canoe. I had only made it a few miles through the park at this point. I would have to move if I hoped to make an entire route today. I grabbed a few quick bites of lunch and put some miles on without anyone needing help when the call came over the radio. A hiker had found something, and I needed to go check it out. A half hour later, I talked to a middle-aged woman who had made a concerning discovery. She found a hat and a note on the trail. I read the letter. "I'm writing this note and leaving it behind because I'm not sure what's happening. The 5 of us friends have been planning this trip forever, even since long before our graduation. But it's always seemed like something came up the last minute and one or more of us could not go. I was almost convinced that some outside force had been working against us for a while. We were cursed to not go camping together until we were too old to enjoy it. I could picture Devin now. He would still go even if he was too old to walk and suffer on the trail. He's always up for camping. I think the guy carries a loaded backpack in his car with himself everywhere he goes. Adrian got here right behind us, followed soon by Dean. Of course, Terry was last to show. We started up the trail in great spirits. 3 miles in, the sun was just starting to heat up. We were making good times toward the rustic campground when Devin decided to take a detour. He said he had heard about an old trail that no one used anymore and wanted to check it out. I said we should keep going the way we were, but I was outvoted. I honestly don't think Terry's vote should have counted since he was stoned, and Devin just bullied him into saying yes. We came to a spot with a large stone off the trail's side. Devin said it was the trailhead, but I didn't see any path. He led us through some heavy brush, but on the other side it cleared out. We could see the faint impression of an overgrown trail. I went last and left my hat on the stone just in case we got lost and if we need to be rescued. I think that's precisely where we're headed, straight toward being lost. I'll leave this note under my hat and hope that someone finds us. I asked the woman to show me where she had found it, and she showed me. 3 miles later, I was staring at the rock I had hoped I would never see again. I radioed my location to the station and told them if they didn't hear from me in a couple of hours to send a search party to the old abandoned trail. I wish I had brought my supplies with me. My backpack and sidearm were 3 miles away, and I didn't know how long these kids had been on this trail. I knew that any wasted time could mean the difference between life and death, not only for myself but for those kids. At least I had my knife, my flashlight, and binoculars. So I thanked the woman, placed the red hat back on the stone just in case, and headed into the heavy bush. Once through the initial overgrowth, the trail became more visible. Old memories flashed through my head, ones I'd never wanted to think about again. I took a deep breath and headed down the path. It was overgrown for the first mile and opened into a field. I could see people had walked before me because the weeds were partially trampled. As I walked through, a deer jumped ahead of me, startling me. Until that moment, I didn't realize how jumpy I was. I tried to settle down and tell myself that these kids were just lost and I could catch up to them and get them out. I was telling myself that, but that didn't make the memories go away. I entered a clearing with a fallen log and another note with a rock was sitting on it. I think I'm being silly. This trail isn't so bad. Maybe I was wrong. Devin seems to know where he's going. Just can't shake this feeling that we're being watched, you know? Sometimes I'll look around and I swear I see a face disappear behind a tree. Am I being paranoid? Maybe if the birds started singing again, that would lighten my mood. But I haven't heard any of the birds or any other animal for a while. I wonder why they're being so quiet. Are they afraid of us? On another note, Terry seems to be brooding more than usual. Maybe he forgot to bring enough of his stash to last the trip. Devin, in his glory, since everyone has to rely on him for directions. Adrienne and Dean seem to be along for the ride. However, I have noticed Dean looking around at the trees as well. Maybe I'll ask if he sees anything. If you're trying to track us down, I hope you aren't being too bothered. I just have this feeling things are gonna go wrong. I folded the note and stuck it in my pocket, then prayed she was wrong about being followed. I pushed on, beginning to miss my backpack with the supplies, especially the water bottles. The trees provided shade, so the sunlight wasn't shining directly on me, but hiking is always thirsty work. The birds chirping in the trees made me almost forget about the desperate mission I was on to save these 5 kids. My mind wandered back to the kid I couldn't help. It had been shortly after I started as a park ranger. An 11-year-old boy had gotten lost on this very trail. His parents searched for him before calling us to look. I remembered hoping to be the one to find him as we formed search parties and searched on, in, and around every inch of the trail. In the end, I got my wish. I found him, but I wish I hadn't. I pushed the memory to the back of my mind and focused on the trail. It was starting to fade. The trampling of feet wasn't making enough of a difference, and I was beginning to lose my way. Out here, that can be deadly. I kept moving forward and finally regained the trail just in time to reach the fork. I looked back and forth from one choice to the other and couldn't really see a difference between the two. I searched for any broken twigs or plants that would give me a hint, but there didn't seem to be any. Just when I was about to give up and flip a coin, I saw a piece of paper in the weeds, barely visible. I dug it out and read it. It seems like we have a dilemma, a fork in the road as it were. You would think I would be happy to see the doubt in Devin's eyes as he looked from one choice to the other, but you'd be wrong. It made my confidence plummet. It made me think that we were never going to get out of here. Everyone's running out of water. Devin yelled at us for not conserving, but I saw him drink the last of his. He ranted and raved at us for a while, but we all knew he was just mad because he didn't know what to do. In the end, he flipped a coin. We all did our best not to laugh. Adrienne is reaching the end of her rope with Devin and his attitude. Dean has been playing peacemaker, trying to keep them all from going at it too much. Terry has been way too quiet. I haven't seen him light up once. Something's up with him. But he says it's nothing every time I ask. The birds still aren't singing, and it's bothering me to the core. This strange feeling I have hasn't gone away. I asked Dean if he had seen anything weird, but he won't talk about it. We've been on this trail for some time. I'm hoping to come to an end soon. In case the note got moved or blown around, we took the left trail. I was panicked by the end of reading that note, and was so relieved when she mentioned which path to take. I radioed in and reported that I was on the course of the missing hikers. I told them I was at the fork and that I took the left side. I was told that there was no search party going on yet, that I was the only one looking for these kids. It was the complete opposite of years ago looking for that kid. Everyone was searching. I know we combed every inch of that wilderness, but that's the thing about the woods. You can search every nook and cranny visible, but something can still stay hidden. The sun was going down and I still had no idea how close I was to catching up to these kids. I could stumble across them in the next clearing, or they could be hours ahead of me. I met the woman who showed me the hat and note in the afternoon. If they started around daybreak, they could be 5 or 6 hours ahead of me. If the leader is driven to continue, it's hard to say how far they might be. I continued following the trail until I saw a fallen tree across a river. I looked both ways along the river's edge but didn't see a path, so I crossed the tree. I could picture the debate the kids had when they got there. I chuckled at the thought of Devin having to convince them to go across. I believe I made up a lot of time with that single crossing. I jumped into the water, drank my fill, and climbed back up feeling much, much better. It was tough to pick up on the trail on the other side. I was glad to find a note sticking to a branch. Oh my gosh, Devin just about came unglued when we got to the tree over the river. He hopped up right away and started to cross, but the rest of us weren't so sure that the trail led that way. We asked him how he would obviously know this, but he said he planned this fallen tree as a part of it. He sputtered, stomped, and told us that we would be lost without him. Dean had finally had enough and told him we were lost because of him. I thought Devin would swing at him until Terry came to his side and told Devin to shut up. The rest of us all came together and told Devin he could keep leading us as long as he stopped acting like a freaking petty tyrant. He didn't take that too well, though. In the end, he told us we could all go to hell. He sat on the log and refused to move. Eventually, we took a break, refilled our water bottles on the river, and Dean said we should keep going and led us across the tree. Devin followed along, acting like a whipped puppy. Dean and I talked about the disappearing face we had seen a while back, but neither of us had seen it again. At the very least, at least the birds were back singing. I chuckled, figuring that Devin would be a big baby over the whole thing, but after the chuckle came concern. Deposed leaders are usually dangerous. I wondered how much offense Devin had taken and how long it would take before he started getting some sort of payback in some small or large way. Darkness was coming on fast in the woods. I had to make a decision, camp for the night or keep going. If I camped, I could defend against the predators that lurked in the darkness, but if I kept moving, there was a good chance I could stumble across the group before daybreak. It wasn't much of a decision. These kids that I don't even know, that I had plunged headfirst into the woods without even my backpack of supplies. Of course, I was going to try and catch up with them. If I had done that years back, would that kid still be alive? Such thoughts nagged at me. Most days I kept them at bay, but here in this same forest, close to where I found him, I needed to focus. If I'm going to get after them, and I'm going to keep up, I need to get going. I stepped off the trail to take a pee and heard a metallic snap simultaneously, and I felt intense pain shoot at my leg. I looked down and I had stepped into a bear trap. I screamed, I fell to the ground and rocked back and forth in agony. After a few minutes, I refocused on getting the trap off of my leg. I found a branch and pried the weapon open, screaming the entire time. I pulled the surprise off my leg and threw it to the side. I didn't want to take my boot off, but I had to see the damage. It took every ounce of effort I could to muster enough to unlace that boot and pull it off. My leg was purple. I felt along the wound very gently, but there didn't seem to be any break. That didn't mean I wouldn't be limping for the next month, though. But it did mean I would buy this brand of boots for the rest of my life. Putting the boot back on took much more effort and screaming, but I knew I needed to keep going. I laced up the boot and found a sturdy branch to use as a crutch. I struggled to my feet and took my first few ginger steps. Once I got into the rhythm, it got more straightforward, but I couldn't walk as fast as I had been. Of course, when I was weakest, I heard footsteps in the trees close to me. I knew it had to be a predator, because it could probably sense how I was vulnerable and probably heard my screams of agony earlier. I leaned against a tree and held my crutch ready as a weapon. The footsteps came closer. They paused as if they knew I was ready, then slowly continued stalking me. They were deliberate but slow. Each step seemed measured as if it were waiting for the right moment to strike. I heard it right next to the tree I was hiding behind. I whipped around as best as I could and raised the crutch to strike. A deer was staring at me for a heartbeat and then turned and ran through the forest. I collapsed against the tree and slid down to the ground, allowing the adrenaline to bleed off. I don't remember falling asleep. I woke to sandpaper scratching the side of my face. I opened and a bear was beside me, licking my cheek. I freaked out, screamed, and rolled away from it. The bear wasn't ready for that reaction. It startled and ran away. I slowly but rapidly contained my breathing and looked around. It was dark. Thin shafts of moonlight beaming through the trees provided a little bit of light. I checked my watch and it was nearly 4 a.m. I rose slowly and gingerly on my injured ankle, took the small flashlight out of my pocket, and prayed it still worked. My prayers were answered when the beam shone brightly through the woods. I panned around trying to get my bearings. After a moment, I found the trail and started hobbling toward it. The nightly noises were a comfort. At least if the crickets were chirping and the rest of the forest was singing its nightly tune, predators likely weren't around. I stumbled and fell, hitting my injured ankle against a rock. The pain overwhelmed me and I screamed. After a few minutes of recovery, I got up and continued at a slower pace, paying more attention to the ground. I chided myself for falling asleep and losing so much time. At least the trail was easy to follow. I continued through the night, hoping I wasn't too late. I started thinking about the boy I had failed to rescue and what would happen if I failed to save these kids too. I'm sure the Rangers department would say I did my best. I wasn't worried about them, it was me who I cared about. Would I be able to forgive myself for letting something happen again? My thoughts were interrupted when I stumbled into a clearing. Not just any clearing, there were remnants of a fire. There were impressions from tent pegs being pulled out of the ground. All around were the signs of a recent campsite, including a tent still set up entirely. I got so excited I nearly fell over my crutch. Looking around for signs of anything, the tent was a mixed blessing. It was very ominous that it was still here while the others were gone, but I could find some supplies to take along for my search. The most important was food. I shoved some protein bars in my pocket while devouring some beef jerky. I also grabbed 2 water bottles from the pack. I stumbled across a note sitting under a rock beside the smoldering fire. Before I sat, I held my hand out to the fire. It was still warm, but the embers were nearly dead. It had been hours since this fire was first lit. I would have thought that I could catch up with them if I hadn't taken such an unintentional nap. There was nothing I could do but sit by the dying fire and read the note, hoping there was good news. We found this clearing and decided to camp. Everyone was tired from walking and the mood was somber because no one seemed to know where we were. We had been hiking in the forest before, but none of us had ever seen or heard of this trail. We set up our tents, started a fire, and then ate and sat around. No one felt like talking, so I tried to get the ball rolling by asking Terry why he was late. He hesitated, but at my prompting eventually told us that he had hit an animal with his car on the way here. I asked if it was a deer and he said no, it was much too big to be a deer. He said it was walking upright on 2 legs and was massive, like 8 feet tall massive, covered in brown hair. He swerved to miss it, but the strangest thing was it seemed to try to jump out in front of him, like it wanted him to stop. We all listened with rapt attention. Just then, off in the distance, we heard a scream. We all froze. Devin started spouting off and yelling at Terry for trying to scare us, storming off. Dean tried to stop him, but he pushed him away and disappeared into the woods. The rest of us talked, trying to decide if we should look for him, but in the end we figured we would just let him go and cool off. We heard a rustling off in the distance and a muffled cry a short while later. We huddled a little closer together and went on high alert. Our eyes darted back and forth as we searched the impenetrable wall of trees surrounding us, looking for any signs of a predator. Right then, the strangest thing happened. All the nightly noises stopped. The crickets, the squirrels, the owls, and every sound you usually hear in the forest at night ceased. It was unnerving. For a moment, I wondered if I hadn't gone deaf. Our eyes darted all around in the darkness. We all huddled closer to the fire. Dean pulled out his hunting knife. None of us said a word. It was like if we spoke, something terrible would happen. Somehow, whatever caused the noises to stop would find us if we spoke. Someone did say, though just not who we expected,
Why are you here?
Came a deep, raspy voice that seemed to echo from everywhere. We all looked around and finally, a man, at least what I would like to call a man, stepped into the light. It was oversized, well over 6 feet tall, broad shoulders, and probably older than any of us combined. It was also wearing what looked like a park ranger's uniform. It looked old and shabby, like he had been wearing it for a long time. There were no name tags or park patches. At that point, we didn't care. We had been rescued. We clamored around him, saying how glad we were that they had found us. We told him about what was going on in the trail, and we weren't sure where we even were. The man listened, slowly saying,
You shouldn't be here.
We all looked at each other, freaked out. I'm sure the others thought the same as me. No shit, we shouldn't be here. We just told you that. He looked at us from one to another, as if he were sizing us up. I was starting to get a little uncomfortable with this silence. I thought he would offer to guide us back, but he didn't. He kept staring. I think everyone else was getting a little edgy when Dean asked if he could point us in the right direction. He looked at Dean as if deciding to answer him or not.
I can guide you,
he said.
But first, you have to have some rest.
We all agreed that the day had been long and stressful. We decided to take his advice and turn it in. We offered him some food and water, but he refused, saying he wasn't hungry. We each went to our tents and laid down. Now, the one thing that just stayed on my mind was how weird his voice sounded. It sounded almost demonic, almost like something trying to pretend to be human. Before I settled in and finished this note, I popped my head back out of my tent to check on our guide. He was sitting by the fire, staring into the orange coals. I thought I heard him mumbling or maybe humming something softly. I quietly zipped up my tent and went to sleep. Sometime later, someone banged on my tent. I awoke and unzipped it to find the ranger with a strange look in his eyes.
We need to go.
Why? I said, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes.
It's not safe here.
He said with an edge of panic. I popped back into my tent to change, then came out and met with everyone. They were all in states of semi-consciousness as well. Everyone but the ranger seemed to be confused.
Pack up. We need to leave.
He said a little more forcefully. I was about to protest when I heard a piercing scream. His head shot up, and he stared in the direction of the sound.
Move it.
He said,
Pack up.
We didn't need to be told again. The scream brought us all fully awake. We tore down our tents repeatedly and packed up everything into our backpacks. As I finished up, I noted Devin's tent was still standing up. Where's Devin? I said.
Who's Devin?
The ranger said. He's another one of our friends, I said. He went off into the woods right before you got here.
He didn't come back?
The ranger asked. Should we go look for him? I said. The ranger extended his arms and did a slow circle.
Which way would you go?
He said. I understood his point. How would we know where he had gone? If he was still on the path or not? It just seemed like we should do something. What about his gear? I said. Do we take it with us? The ranger looked at me almost like he was annoyed at answering so many questions.
Leave it here, in case he comes back.
He said.
You'll need his supplies.
I'm not sure if I'll keep leaving notes or not now that we have a ranger to guide us. Whoever finds this, please look for Devin and make sure he's okay. After reading this note, I was perplexed. A ranger? All the rangers at this park are in their 30s or 40s. Maybe it was someone who retired and was just roaming around out here? But why would they be out here in the middle of the night? And why would they be in some sort of ranger's outfit? Sitting here by the dying embers of the fire, with a tent set up in front of me, it was very tempting to take a rest. If they're in the hands of a capable ranger, I could get some rest before the long hike back out of here. But I knew I already had taken my rest for the night. If not for that, I would have been here hours ago, probably before the other ranger. I set out again, feeling tired but determined. The campsite made me more hopeful than I had been all day. At least they were together and thinking like campers. If only I knew who this ranger was. The sun was an hour away from rising, so I took out my flashlight to follow the trail. I zipped up the tent before I left, just in case the owner returned. I wouldn't want animals getting in and taking everything. It's bad enough when injured park rangers do it. The trail stayed level for a while as dawn peeked over the trees slowly. The course started heading upward, which was terrible news for me and my bum ankle. It made things much harder, but I had my trusty makeshift crutch to help me. Dawn crept into the forest, giving me a little assistance. At least I wouldn't have to waste a hand on holding a flashlight. As the climb grew steeper, the trail grew more narrow. At times it was only the width of a foot. As I scaled the narrow path, I held onto trees and whatever I could. At the most difficult, I paused and seriously considered turning back. As I looked around for any other way to keep going, I saw brightly colored fabric at the bottom of the ravine. I carefully balanced as I took out my binoculars and looked. It was a backpack, and attached to it was the body of a girl in her early 20s. She looked like she had hit her head on the rocks at the bottom. Her face was bloody and mauled. Her clothes were ripped and soaked in blood. There was no doubt that an animal had gotten to her. The only question was she alive when it started feeding on her? I looked away, but I felt my determination doubling down to find these missing kids. They might be with the ranger, but they were still in terrible danger. I slowly continued up the narrow trail. At this time, I was sure the ground would give out from under me, and I would share the same fate as that poor, unfortunate girl at the bottom of the ravine. It was then I remembered my radio. I tried to call in and report the location of the body, but the only response I got was static. I was determined to try again when I got to the top of the trail. It was yet another motivation to keep going, to be careful and to survive. It seemed like hours at a snail's pace, working my way up the side of the ravine. Finally, I clawed my way over the top of the edge. I rolled over onto the solid ground and lay there for a few minutes. Once I caught my breath, I got up slowly and painfully. I hadn't done my ankle any favors. I limped toward what looked like the trail and began following. It wasn't long before I came across the remnants of another campsite. Fire was a little warmer than the last one. I stoked it up, threw some more wood, and got it going. I knew I needed some rest. I searched around, found a note, then sat down on a log by the fire to read it. I can't believe Adrienne is gone. We started up this steep ravine, and the trail kept getting narrow. I asked the ranger if there was any other way around it, and he just glared at me and said no. We all struggled with our heavy packs on our back. At one point, I was on all fours just trying to keep from sliding into the ravine. That's when it happened. Adrienne was having trouble keeping her feet on the trail. She kept slipping. I reached out and helped her balance a few times. Being right in front of me, I kept an eye on her whenever possible. But to be truthful, I wasn't watching nearly as much as I wanted because I was watching my own feet. She slipped once. I tried to grab her, but she had tipped over. The weight of her pack dragged her over the side. I watched in horror as she tumbled down into the ravine, bouncing off trees as she went. I saw her skull make a tangible impact several times as she tumbled down to the bottom and slid to a stop. I wouldn't know if she was still breathing or not as I called her name. She didn't move. I reached for the ranger in front of us and pointed to her unmoving body. He stared at her for a long time. I don't know if he was trying to see if she was alive or not. He told us to keep going up the trail to the top and he would check on her. I watched as he carefully made his way down to the nearly sheer slope. We kept moving forward as instructed. He was only halfway down when we made it to the top. I was a wreck. I was so happy we made it, but sad for Adrienne. I didn't hold out much hope that the ranger would come trotting back into camp with her on his back, saying she only had a few bumps and bruises. We started the fire and sat around in a stupor. Finally, Terry came over and talked to me. "Look, I understand she was your friend, but she was ours too," he said. "We need to work together to get out of here, for them." "That's so stupid. It makes no sense," I said with the remnants of a smile. It was then the ranger reappeared. He sat by the fire and didn't say a word. There was something in his eyes. It wasn't sadness, but I don't know exactly what it was. We knew she wasn't coming back. We rested for some time, then started on the trail again. If you're following us, I hope you're being careful. Stay safe. Wow, this girl is something else. She wants me to be safe with all she's gone through. I hope I find her. I think she'd make a great park ranger personally. My guilty conscience jumped up on my back and yelled at me. How can you sit around and rest when that girl just lost her friend and needs your help? I knew it was right. I just didn't know why the other ranger was so careless. I struggled to get up, kick out the fire, and started after them. The daylight was dimming, but it only was 8 in the morning. I looked up and saw why. Storm clouds were overtaking the sky. Yet another reason I wished I had brought my backpack along. The raindrops hit like cold slaps in the face. Even though it was still September, out here in the mountains, the weather can change in a heartbeat. We weren't at the top of the hill, but in the middle was enough for the weather change to make me shiver. Now that we were out of the ravine, I tried my radio again, but it was still static. I knew there were some places where the radio inexplicably wouldn't work. I just hoped to escape the interference before it was far too late. The trail was clear in front of me, but that was little comfort when walking in open fields with no rain cover. All those trees I tromped through, and now in the rain, I have wide open spaces. I'd say someone doesn't like me. The rain didn't just pass like a spring shower. It poured so hard it became difficult to see even an inch in front of me. For a long time, I trudged through the rain. At times, it felt like I was walking in place. The mud was starting to cake on my boots, and then my salvation appeared. In front of me, on the trail, was a tent. I called out before I unzipped the tent and let myself in. I flopped to the beautiful dry floor, quickly turned and zipped the entrance back up. I breathed a sigh of relief, but a stench assaulted my nose as I did. I looked over at the sleeping bag. It was full. "I'm sorry to barge in like this, but I need to get out of the rain," I said. No response. I nudged the person in the bag. It tipped over to the side and rocked right back. That's when I noticed the splotches of red that had soaked through the bag. I didn't want to see, but I pulled the top of the sleeping bag away from the person's face. The bad part was that they no longer had a face. It had been ripped away, and the neck had been gouged out. There were large wounds on the body as well. I tried to feel for a pulse, but my fingers went straight into the neck muscles. I figured there was no pulse to feel. I wiped my fingers on the sleeping bag and pondered why this person was covered. I know the animal who did this didn't gently cover up the person with the sleeping bag when it was done. I found my answer lying above the head on the person. It was a note. "I can't believe Terry's dead. I wish I'd never come on this trip. I wish I'd never let Devin bully us into turning down this damn trail. Where the hell is Devin anyway? When he stormed off on his little pity party, did he run across whatever creature has been stalking us? Is he sitting back in his tent now, enjoying himself? I don't know. We enjoyed not climbing up the face of a ravine, but we were exhausted. I mentioned stopping and camping for a little bit to the ranger. He looked at us and even sniffed the air. That seemed like a weird thing to do. But after that, he agreed to let us set up camp. He even told us to do it quickly as we could. We gathered wood for a fire, and then he told us not to bother because the rain was coming. I guess that explains the air sniffing thing. Our tents had been up for maybe 15 minutes since it started raining. It quickly turned into a downpour. We all offered the ranger to sit in our tents with us. He looked over us one by one. It was pretty creepy. Finally, he said he would sit with Terry in his tent. Dean and I looked at each other with relieved expressions. The ranger is helping us after all, but he isn't someone I'd like to ever see again. He just acts too weird. At times, I wonder if he's even helping at all. I just closed my eyes, listening to the rain on the tent and letting it carry me off to dreamland. When the ranger ripped open my tent, he said we needed to pack up right now, that something was hunting us. We dove out into the rain, miserably packed our tents. He reassured us that there was a cave nearby that we could get to for shelter. As I was packing up, I didn't see Terry, so I went to his tent and knocked. When there was no answer, I went in and found what was left of his body. Something had torn him to shreds. I covered my mouth to avoid vomiting and ran the hell to the others. Dean and the ranger looked in and saw what was left of him. The ranger said he had left the tent to go to the bathroom, and when he came back, he saw a predator hanging around the tents. That's when he came to wake us. It must have already gotten to Terry. I pulled his sleeping bag over his head and wished we had given him a proper burial. But the ranger said the animal might be back for the rest of us, so we quickly packed up and left. I barely had time to finish this note. Please help us. A cave? What kind of ranger is he? Doesn't he realize that this is most likely where some sort of large predator would call home? I thought for a moment about what cave they could be talking about. I haven't been on this trail for some 5 years, ever since I found the kid here. Then it hit me. We were very close to a place where we found the kid. Why would he take him there unless... I jumped up so quickly that I nearly fell on top of the body when I forgot that if I put too much weight on my injured ankle, I'm gonna collapse. I hobbled out of the tent and went as quickly as possible toward the place I swore I'd never see again. I approached the cave and my heart sank. 2 backpacks sat just inside the entrance. I pulled out my knife and flashlight, then cautiously peeked inside. I felt a change in the breeze and turned to find the ranger staring at me. I looked him up and down. "You," I said. "The last time I saw you was when we found the boy." He said nothing. "It was never a random animal attack," I said. "It was you."
I wonder if it was to watch you years ago as you floundered around, looking for some predator that stood beside you.
"You son of a..." I pulled out my knife and held it ready. He paused, then smiled.
Do you think that knife can hurt me?
I looked at it. "Pretty sure," I said. "It's made of iron." His smile vanished.
So you know what I am?
I pulled out a bottle of brown water. I made sure to grab some runoff from the rainstorm, I said. "It might not do as good as rust water, but let's find out." I opened the bottle and threw some water at him. He dodged it as though it was acid. At the same time, I swung with the knife. He escaped it with ease. "Why won't you show me your true form?"
Because then, you would know what I truly am. And I'm sure you'd love to take advantage of vulnerable moments.
He swung and connected with my stomach, knocking the wind out of me. I recovered and swung the knife in a vicious downswing at him, which he easily dodged. I kept moving forward, stabbing and slashing at him, not giving them any chance to think or rest. I couldn't get close enough to connect. He was somehow way too fast. If I hadn't been injured, I probably would have been able to close the distance between me and this thing. This thing is something I've only read about in lore before, but never thought was actually real. Unfortunately, I forgot about my injured ankle in the heat of the moment. I stepped forward on my good leg and faltered when I tried to put weight on the injured one. Instead of burying the knife in his heart, it went right through his left thigh. He screamed in pain and ran out of the cave. I took out my flashlight and started toward the back of the cave. There, I found a mutilated body next to a pile of bones. There was a note in her hand. I sat down, took it, and read. I can't believe how stupid I was not to see this much sooner. All the time guiding us was just a ploy. He never wanted to help us. He never cared about any of us or our safety. I need to write this quickly before he comes back. The ranger led us here, and told us to wait here and that we'd be safe in the cave. He left us alone. Dean pulled out his flashlight and explored more profound areas into the cave. He found a large pile of bones. Off to the side of them was a pile of clothes. We ran toward the opening, but the ranger had already returned.
Still, you didn't listen.
He said, leering at us.
I told you to sit here. Now explain me home.
What are you?
I said. He smiled for the first time since I'd met him, but his smile wasn't comforting. It was terrifying. I watched in horror as he changed into a giant cat-like creature. It didn't look quite like a panther or a mountain lion. He lunged at us with incredible speed. He grabbed my leg and tore a large gash into it. I fell into the floor, screaming. Dean tried to defend me, swinging his knife around and holding it at bay, but it stalked around him and cornered him. He only had one chance. He looked at me with sadness and then ran past the creature and out of the cave. It looked at me and then my leg, then sprinted out after Dean. I know why he did it. He was trying to give me time to escape, but with my leg, there was no way. I couldn't outrun anything. What he did do was give me the time to say goodbye.
If you're reading this, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I led you to your death. If you somehow survive and make it out of here, please tell our families what happened. Goodbye. I fought back the tears as I read the final words of this brave girl. I limped out to the front of the cave and looked out as the rain stopped. It was like seeing a new world being born. I tried my radio and got an immediate answer. I gave them my GPS coordinates and told them to prepare for casualties. I'm still a park ranger even months later. I made sure that the trail was sealed off. I carry an iron knife and rust water with me at all times. I have the rust water and a squirt gun just in case.
The bones were removed from the cave and subjected to DNA testing. Aside from this group of victims, including Devin, several others had gone missing in the park over the years. The official version of the events was that a rogue animal had been hunting people. I was told it was best for my career if I didn't reveal the true nature of the predator. I still search for the creature and post signs everywhere to look for an older ranger wearing a uniform with no patches. There's a number to call if anyone spots him. It's my cell phone number. Occasionally, I hear reports of a large cap limping on its hind leg. I try to make my way to that spot as quickly as possible, but I have yet to catch him. I posted this story in memory of that brave girl, but also as a warning. Never go on an unposted trail and beware of those you meet in the woods, even if they wear a uniform. They may just turn out to be something we can't comprehend. A creature, hidden and lost from history.